Greetings and welcome to part 2 of our spooky season special on the 101 actual scariest movie moments. I'm not going to run through... Actually, yeah. Should I run through everything we covered last time?
If you like to.
No. I'm not going to run through every single moment here, so you got to go listen to part 1 if you want to know where we're at. And we're going to jump right into it here, because we got a lot to cover, and we only got so much time in the world before, the sun expands and absorbs us all.
That's right.
I'm Gabe Powers, and with me again is Patrick Ripoll.
Hi, how's it going? The long-winded brothers are back.
The long-winded brothers, twins and warriors in speaking too much.
We're here to promise you that every single moment we talk about on this episode is scarier than the previous episode.
Right, because we worked that out scientifically.
Yep. It's extremely important, the exact order of things.
We had so many spreadsheets, it was unbelievable.
That's right. Did heart rate tests. We
took polls across 30 states.
Mm-hmm. Don't ask which 30. It's a secret.
No, it's a secret. You can't know. But, fuck Idaho.
Anyway. Yeah. All right. Well, that's 49 left to guess from. But at any rate, we're here. We got another 25 movies for you this time. This time, I think it's your turn to start, Gabe.
Yes, it is. And so I'm starting with number 70.
That's right.
Number 70, Shock. This is the Mario Bava film called Shock. There's a lot of movies called Shock. Released in 1977. This was released in the U.S. as Beyond the Door 2. Has nothing to do with that Exorcist ripoff, but it does have a bit of an Exorcist vibe. Bava was kind of going for that for sure. This is Bava's final completed feature. One more was released later because it was unfinished, Rabid Dogs. And it isn't one of his best movies, but it's still a very good movie, and it's got a nice central performance from Daria Nicolodi before she was an item with Dario Argento. And she mostly just has to scream the whole movie, and she pulls it off pretty well. For how little the script demands of her, she does a good job. But it's a sort of paranoid thriller in the tradition of Repulsion and Images. And there are so many just like her being driven mad by her child, who she thinks has been haunted by the spirit of her ex-husband, who was abusive. Just amongst this never-ending parade of just random happenings and her being freaked out, there's this one perfect little shot where Bava stages the hallway, and the little boy comes to the end of the hallway and says, "Mom," and then runs towards her out of frame, just under frame, and then a full-grown man springs up and scares her. And it's just a very simple, very short shot. This is called either a Texas switch or a cowboy switch, where you have usually a stuntman fall off camera and the actor stand up then. And so it looks like one continuous shot. But Bava wanted to use it for a scare where it looks like a little boy morphs into a full-grown man.
The match of motion on this is really incredible. The exact speed the boy is traveling and the man is traveling. Like, they must have done some practicing. They must have done some really good rehearsals, good choreography, something. But like, the match is perfect.
And because of that, it's just I mean, once you know it's coming, it's not as scary. But the first time you see the movie, it's like such a good magic trick, and it freaks you out.
What do you think the chances are that James Wan has ripped this off in a movie, or like in one of the Conjureverse movies, this exact shot pops up?
I mean, it could be. I've only seen the first 2 Conjuring, and maybe I don't think I've seen any of the other Conjuring movies, and he is a bona fide Mario Bava fan, so
it feels like such a perfect gag, and those movies feel so built around this kind of gag. Like, it feels impossible to me that they've made like 17 of those and they haven't had a single one where they ripped off this shot. It just had to have happened.
Yeah. Probably in The Nun. I'm just gonna say, without having ever seen it, that this happens in The Nun.
It's definitely a little girl in her communion dress runs, and then the nun pops up full grown.
Yep. Yeah, that definitely 100% happens in that film. And if it doesn't, it sounds like I'm being funny. But if it does, it sounds amazing because I've never seen it and I predicted it.
Yeah, that's very, very smart of you.
I am. And
Number
or
6.
Funny.
Yeah.
Go on.
Sorry. Number 69 is Dr. X from 1932, which is directed by Michael Curtiz, and it's sort of a favorite of mine. It's probably the most bizarre horror movie of the 30s. Mm-hmm. And you look at it and immediately you understand why, because it's shot in 2-strip Technicolor. And if you're not familiar with 2-strip Technicolor, it's an early color film process that only used 2 colors. Everything was a combination of green and red. And if you've never seen that before, like just right now, go on YouTube, look up Dr. X, look up 2-strip Technicolor, find a video, because the effect is bizarre, because it's not realistic. It's color, but it's not, there's certain things you can do right. Like green and red, you can get pretty good skin tones. Green and red, you can get okay shadows. Anytime the sky or the ocean, it's just like this very weird light green. There's not a lot of, the sets kind of all blur together. It's just a very strange look. It's not realistic. It almost has like this like bruised gangrenous, like the whole film itself is kind of like molding or something. And that makes for a really interesting horror atmosphere. And it was a very rare movie for Warner Brothers. They were a studio that didn't make a lot of horror movies. They were more known for their very contemporary urban kind of films, particularly at this point, their gangster movies following Public Enemy. So the thing that sort of separates this from a lot of the earlier horror films is those were all like adaptations of 19th century novels like Frankenstein or Dracula, but this takes place in a modern city. So it's got like this kind of modern, almost screwball feel to it, where it's kind of comedic, and the lead is like this fast-talking reporter. He's trying to get to the bottom of this series of murders that's been happening in the city. The murders themselves are one of the really bizarre parts, because it's just so beyond the pale. It's 1932. You can shock people with just regular old-fashioned murders. But in this case, every full moon, women are being murdered, and then they're being carved up with a scalpel and eaten. And when the police go to a nearby medical academy to try to get some more information about, like, well, what do you know, they're basically trying to get some consulting done from Dr. X and his medical academy. What they discover is everyone who works at this medical academy basically has the potential to be a cannibalistic sex criminal. Because they all have some weird tie to either the moon or to cannibalism or to murder. It is the weirdest collection of freaks that ever ran a hospital. And so the Dr. X ends up setting up a plan to catch the killer, thinking it's one of his doctors. It's basically the weirdest Hamlet homage ever, because what he does is he ties all of his colleagues down, and then he attaches them to blood pressure monitors, and then he makes his servants reenact the murders in front of them, and then he monitors their blood pressure, and whoever gets the horniest from watching women being eaten and murdered and eaten, that's probably the killer. So it's like sort of the end of Hamlet, where they stage the play to catch the killer of Hamlet's dad. It's just fucking bizarre. It's such a strange movie. And the scene I want to talk about is the reveal of the killer. Because it turns out, spoiler alert for this movie from 1932, the killer is Dr. Wells, and he was the only one who before wasn't considered a suspect because he only has one arm. But in this scene, we see him correct that with an extremely painful procedure in which he coats his entire body in synthetic flesh. First, he attaches this like fake arm that he has in a hidden compartment in his laboratory. He attaches it to his amputated limb, and then he holds it under this like electrical device to activate it, I guess, or to attach it to his arm. And this shot is like a real transformer, so it's like you actually see sparks of electricity arcing out from all the fingers and stuff. This whole scene, by the way, there's no music. It's the 1932 early talkie. There's not a lot of music happening during the scenes. And then the really weird part happens where he kneels down in front of this like bubbling witch's cauldron that he keeps in the center of his laboratory. And he keeps repeating the phrase synthetic flesh over and over. But when I say he keeps repeating the phrase, what I should say is that the phrase synthetic flesh keeps repeating over and over. The actor never says the words.
Yeah.
At no point does his mouth move during these scenes. So it's just like very weird. Again, it has this crazy color scheme, and it's him smearing this like mud or clay on his face that is actually fake skin in order to turn himself into a monster, which has nothing to do with the murders, by the way. That's just like a whole other wrinkle that they didn't even know, was that the murderer also dresses himself up to be like this weird lumpy monster before he does it. It's just like really hallucinatory is the word I would use. Everything about the motions and everything is very slow, and you just hear constant arcing and bubbling, and Michael Curtiz sets up in the foreground these like arcs of electricity, so the entire frame is there's just all these out of focus electricity arcs going on over it. It's really bizarre, and it's really unnerving and creepy, and it's a movie where you think you're prepared for the weirdest because it's already been so weird. And when that happens and the movie just stops dead for 3 minutes to watch a man smear fake skin over his skin, it really is just like unsettling in a way that it's hard to put your finger on. And it's like one of the joys of watching old horror movies is you think you understand what they're capable of and what they are and they are not willing to do. And then you'll see a movie like Dr. X that pushes it so far over that edge and goes in such a weird direction you never think of, that it's like, oh, I guess also there was body horror in 1932. Yeah. It wasn't just Frankenstein tossing a little girl in a lake. It was also synthetic flesh. So that is, for me, the number 69. Nice. Actual scariest movie moment.
Well, so I've still not seen this entire movie, which is a problem because I just didn't have time. But you did send me this scene as a YouTube clip. And out of context, it's just as bizarre. And what you're talking about, the synthetic flesh and the sort of sound of the arc thing is enough that it really, and I'm not even sure that this doesn't already exist, but it feels like a music video and the sample basis for a late 90s techno song.
Oh, yeah. There's no chance in hell that a little clip of this scene has not popped up in some White Zombie or Rob Zombie music video. I think actually I do know for sure that the old TNT Monster Vision, before it was hosted by Joe Bob Briggs, that intro, which was made up of a lot of old film clips, had some Dr. X stuff in it. So it's definitely like quintessential mad scientist imagery.
And so yeah, the sound of it, I can just hear synthetic flesh, and then like Chemical Brothers, coming in, and then but it also looks like a really low budget, like if there was like a death metal band also in the late 90s that just didn't have the budget to shoot a video and didn't know what else to do, but didn't want to be like too disgusting, would use this clip and intersplice it with really awful cam footage of them on stage at like some tiny club or something.
Yeah.
Like it has this like because it feels, something about it feels really 1990s to me, and I don't know how to explain it exactly, but it feels like the kind of thing that sample culture video and musical sample culture would have just loved in the mid to late 90s. And so it's this really old movie that somehow feels modern, but modern in a way that's already 30 years old. It's very cool, and so I do want to watch the complete film for sure.
Yeah, it's worth seeing. And then the other two-strip Technicolor horror movie that Michael Curtiz did, Mystery of the Wax Museum, also worth seeing. I like those both quite a bit. And then he also did The Walking Dead with Boris Karloff, but that's in black and white. Who cares? Do you know off the top of your head if the one color scene in Phantom of the Opera is two-strip? No, that was, I believe, hand-painted.
But there's like, oh, it was? Okay. Because, there's just that one scene at the party that is like in color.
Oh, you know, that... I'm trying to think. That might have been two-strip. I do think two-strip, the earliest I can think of is like 1929, so there might be some overlap there. I don't know. But it definitely has that, like, there's a reason Guy Madden built an entire career out of how evocative movies from this era look. And it definitely has that feel to it, like the same way that the Phantom of the Opera scene you're talking about does.
So I just did a very quick Google search, and videos come up that say Phantom of the Opera 2 strip Technicolor sequence. That's not really research, but it sounds like at least someone else thinks that that's what happened.
All right, excellent.
That's enough research for now.
Synthetic flesh.
Moving on to number 68, not so nice. My favorite film of the late 90s, Ravenous, from 1999, directed by Antonia Bird. And Luana and I talked about this pretty recently on the Horror Western episode, which is an episode I based entirely around the fact that I love this movie, and Luana had said something on Facebook about liking it too. And so I said, oh my God, need an excuse to talk about this movie. So here's an excuse to talk about it again. It's a fucking fabulous movie. It's a very late 90s, but also a little bit timeless. Just a film about a disgraced, I believe he's a general, or he's a captain, and he's Captain Boyd. He is disgraced and sent to the Sierra Nevada mountains to a outpost in the middle of nowhere, where he is just going to sit around and die in the snow, and he's surrounded by misfits. And after we are introduced to all the misfits and his disgrace, a mysterious character played by Robert Carlyle appears, and he's emaciated, and they bring him in and they ask him what happened, and he tells this horrible story. It's basically the Donner Party story, if you don't know the Donner Party, but it's a wagon train breaks down in the freezing mountains. I believe they're on the Oregon Trail, and the survivors are reduced to cannibalism because there's so much snow and there's no food. And this is technically a comedy western horror mashup, and for a lot of the movie it's quite funny, or it is trying very hard to be a sort of metaphor for westward expansion. But in this one scene, Antonia Bird lets it get just full on horror because she needs to unload a whole bunch of exposition. And we later learned that Carlyle's character is not to be trusted, that he is telling what is probably a true story, but he is telling it from the point of view of a victim and not the perpetrator. It could have been just a simple story. There's a simple flashback sequence where he's narrating the whole thing, and none of the characters are talking, and it's a lot of time lapse going on. But what really makes it work is that Carlyle, one, is doing this great job of playing a villain, playing a victim. And the thing that really makes it is the soundtrack by Damon Albarn of Gorillaz and Blur fame, and Michael Nyman, which throughout the movie is a sort of they got a bluegrass group, and they made them do loops, is the best way to describe this score for this particular film, is live loops, but with non-electronic instruments. But at this point, they have this really driving bass line and this just building of elements, and they just keep building and building and building, and it's just so much dread caked into it. And there's repetition to the time signatures and the layering, and it brings out so much dread because it's just a story of people losing control and voting to eat each other, and women and children being involved, and how horrible this is. And there's also the fact that it's slightly based on a true story that we don't really know about. There's basically two famous cannibalism stories from this time and place, and it's the Alfred Packer story, where one man went on one of these trips and he survived, and he talked about how there was cannibalism, and everybody's like, well, that sounds like he murdered everybody. And then there's the Donner Party, which is a little more famous. You've seen this movie, correct?
Oh yeah. This movie's great. The way I always thought about the music is 19th century John Carpenter.
Yeah,
where it's that like minimalist sort of drone, but it's it's a banjo and a violin and an accordion rather than a synthesizer.
Right. Good stuff. Love this movie. Feel like I kind of shoehorned it into this list, but I still think this scene's really sweet and effective.
It's a creepy scene, and Robert Carlyle is great in this movie.
Yes.
It is a great villain performance. Number 67 is A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, The Dream Warriors, from 1987. It's directed by Chuck Russell, the second Chuck Russell, because we talked about the Blob remake earlier. Yeah. Will we be talking about more Chuck Russells? I don't know. How scary is Jim Carrey's The Mask? We'll find out. But it's also co-written by Frank Darabont, like that Blob remake. And I mean, I love the original Nightmare on Elm Street, and I love how Wes Craven keeps things so surreal and dreamy throughout. And I love how that first movie is much less literal and much less about the rules of the universe than the sequels are. But I really do think Part 3 is where the series found its calling, and it's like, okay, this is what this was made to be. This is what it had to be, in which the dream sequences reflect very specific fears that the teenage protagonists have. And because the movie's set in a psychiatric hospital for troubled youth, there's just like so much empathy for the characters. There's no, so many teen slasher movies, especially by 1987, are just like, look at these assholes. Isn't it hilarious to watch them die? And everyone in this movie, even the people who are assholes, you're like, oh, I feel for you though. They're trying, and there's this feeling of helplessness they have, and they're imprisoned. It's basically a prison for children, and they're totally disempowered, and they have all these other issues on top of it, whether it's drug abuse or suicidal thoughts or stuff like that. And it just, all that makes them more vulnerable for Freddy. And then that in turn makes Freddy a better villain because it can really emphasize his cruelty. The other thing about Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3 is I think it's where the series and maybe the entire decade peaked in terms of innovative and memorable like horror special effects. Like, this movie has so many fucking amazing gags and moments. Every kill has some like really great touch to it. Every time I watch this movie, and it's a movie I've seen like 15 times, there's a moment where I'm like, oh, that's right. There's a room where there's just a bunch of bodies hanging from nooses. I totally forgot about this one shot. The one that sticks with me the most, though, and that really every single time still just really grosses me out, is the death of Philip. And Philip, he seems like a really sweet kid. He's very attractive, but like, that's every Nightmare on Elm Street movie. They always get like the most catalog model looking kids. That's always really attractive. Especially you like compare and contrast. Like Friday the 13th, it seems like it's a lot more normal looking people in it, but in Nightmare on Elm Street, it's always these models who get killed. So he's this like beautiful, sensitive, sweet boy who's this sculptor, and he isn't allowed to have proper tools because he tried to slit his wrist once. And so in this nightmare, he has a clay marionette that takes the form of Freddy in this like really cool stop motion effect, and the puppet frees itself from its strings and falls to the floor. And then there's this really cool shot where Robert Englund just grows to full size at the foot of the bed, and it has this very uncanny feeling. And I think the way they did it was they just had Robert Englund stand in front of a green screen and they dollied a camera towards him. And I think that's how they did it's a really neat, weird effect. And that's just the beginning, because what he does next is he yanks Philip's sheets away and he slits his wrists and he pulls out the tendons of Philip's arms like strings of a marionette. And this whole time there's like almost like a sleep paralysis thing going on where Philip, he's sort of helpless and he doesn't try to run. He doesn't scream. He's just sort of there watching as this really, really grotesque effect takes place. There's all these like really deep canals dug out of his legs and arms where the tendons have been ripped out. And all the special effects in this movie, all the gore, there's a really good balance between like over the top comic book kind of style and like really visceral, realistic body horror. There's just something about the texture of the flesh and of the veins and of the guts and everything that is all like very creepy and spooky, but then the overall design feels like it's straight out of a cartoon or a comic book.
And it really was them, also them skirting the line to get that R rating, which is one of the best cases of that, I think, where filmmakers were aware that the MPAA might get them an X rating if they went too far, so they're planning ahead, I think.
Yeah. I think the MPAA always went harder on movies that seemed imitatable. Which is why they went after Friday the 13th more than they went after Nightmare on Elm Street, because Friday the 13th, anyone can, pick up an axe and kill someone.
Yeah.
But like, But yes, you are correct in that, like, it just skirts a line where it is maybe the grossest thing you've ever seen, but also somehow it doesn't seem like it's too far.
It's movie magic. Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. So Freddy pulls the tendons taut with this like really sickening like rope tightening sound effect, and he puppets Philip around like a marionette. And it's again like Philip's totally aware of it as he's walking around with his wrists out, and he's like being sort of yanked around, and you just imagine your own tendons being yanked. It's like one of the most horrific things you can imagine. And the interesting gimmick here, and this actually might tie into sleep paralysis now that I think about it, is that they've already established that Philip sleepwalks. And so that when everyone else looks and they see him, he's left his bed and he's doing this weird sort of stilted walk, they all think he's sleepwalking. But it takes one kid to go like, wait a second, this isn't right. Freddy must be getting him, because at this point, all of the kids know about Freddy. And that's one of the great touches of the movie is the movie starts, all the kids already know about Freddy, and they're already trying to help each other out from it. So like you can just skip a bunch of exposition that way. The worst part of any horror movie is people telling each other that the horror movie isn't happening when we, the audience, know that the horror movie is happening.
Yeah.
And this movie doesn't bother with any of that bullshit, really. And there's this kind of Wes Craven thing I think of in terms of voyeurism. I more with the Scream series, but like there's something especially horrible about the idea of your death being witnessed by other people, and more horrible than that if it's witnessed by other people and they don't know it, like what they're actually seeing. So the idea that Philip sees these people like look at him and go, "Oh, Philip, go back to bed," and they don't know that he's about to die, and he can't say anything because he has this sleep paralysis. It's like really, really upsetting. And there's this like just strange pulsing sound that goes on. And Angelo Badalamenti did the score, and there's a lot of like this choir synth that is really cool because like the choir samples sound a little bit shitty, but it doesn't quite have that like full moon like this sounds like garbage. Like it's just, there's something eerie about the fakeness of the voices in the score. And eventually Freddy leads him up to a ledge in a bell tower, and all the other kids are trying to wake him up and trying to scream and get him help, but he cuts the strings, and Philip plunges to his death, which of course all of the adults think it was a suicide because he had done a previous suicide attempt, but they know better. Even if they didn't actually see Freddy, they know what happened. And it's just a combo of like really, really great gore, helplessness, and then just also the personal touch of tying it into something like teen suicide, which is, very personal and real, and mental illness and all these things are like, you don't think of a movie where Freddy says "Welcome to Primetime, bitch" as a movie that's like quote unquote elevated horror, but it is like still a movie about about real life topics, and that balance it walks between all these things is why Dream Warriors is so great, and why that scene particularly is amazing. So that's why it's number 67.
And I have a short story about this. So when I first moved out of the house at 18, I had a roommate who I haven't spoken to him in years. He had a major phobia of veins and vein-related things.
Oh, Christ.
So to the point where, like, you couldn't talk about veins around him, and he would just, like, he's like, just don't. And so we were roommates for about 6 months before I moved to Phoenix from Tucson. And I had decided, I've only seen the original Nightmare on Elm Street. I'm going to watch all these. So I rented them. And he's like, he wasn't a horror movie fan, but he said, "Oh, yeah, I hear these are like, at least, at the very least, cool special effects." And we're watching this movie, and he's like, "Oh, I've seen this one for sure." And we get to this scene, and suddenly he like turns white, and he turns to me and he says, Gabe, I'm remembering. This is what gave me my vein phobia. I saw this too young. And it wasn't cathartic. He didn't get through it. He had to look away the whole time.
No, you don't need a vein phobia to have to look away from this one.
Yeah.
Oh my God. That's so funny that he did not remember that he
had buried it. He had buried that. The reason he had the vein phobia, he had buried it. On to number 66. This is another case of me sort of shoehorning something in here, but I wanted to be kind of more eclectic with this. This is Death Laid an Egg from 1968. This is by Giulio Questi, and this was a Bird with the Crystal Plumage, Giallo. And I've talked about this before, but for those who haven't heard that, Bird with the Crystal Plumage, Dario Argento's film, was a huge hit, and it was sort of a hard reset for Gialli because there had been movies up until 1970 that were popular, and there was all sorts of... Umberto Lenzi had his version of it, Mario Bava had his version of it, and those were all kind of building. Then Bird with Crystal Plumage becomes an international hit, and suddenly everybody changes gears and tries to make versions of that. So it's like a totally new thing after that. So Death Laid an Egg was made in a time before there was a pattern set. So it's very different from what you would expect from most gialli, to the point where if you're not familiar with the genre and you are in it for the body count and the creative murder scenes, you might not enjoy it. But it sort of doubles as a very dark comedy and a thriller, and the whole thing is set against a backdrop of a state-of-the-art chicken farm where the guy who we suspect the whole film is the murderer owns this farm. It's like a family thing. And the murder in question has taken place around there, and we think that he's fed someone to the chickens. So the backdrop is just surreal and weird. And there's a clear anti-corporate message. But I think the bigger concept is just to be a nightmarish thing, because chicken farms... And this is like before we had them as crazy as they are now, where how separated the chickens are. These chickens could still walk around. But there's just something really upsetting about all the fucking noise that chickens make, and the fact that they don't have any fear of humans, so they don't respect your personal space. And they're kind of cute, but when you get like so many of them, there's that sort of swarm mentality when too many of any small animal becomes disgusting. But anyway, there is a sort of mad scientist working for the company. And again, this is a murder mystery. Someone has died, and we suspect it's him. But meanwhile, there is a side plot about this mad scientist trying to create the perfect chicken for eating. In the middle of the movie, the main character is called in because the scientist has created genetically engineered chickens with no heads and no wings. They're just meat. And his wife, I believe it's his wife. He has a wife and a lover. This is his wife, is like, isn't this amazing? You realize how much money we're going to make off these featherless, headless chicken blobs? And he is not having it. He's like, no, this is like a disgrace. This is a crime against nature. And they're like, no, we'll make so much money. What is your problem here? And it's just already such an off-putting, weird scene that again, doesn't necessarily have much to do with the plot. It has more to do with his mental state. And he sort of says, no, I'm putting my foot down. This is the end of it. And the scientist and his wife sort of storm off. And then he just whips out a shovel and mashes these horrible monstrosities into paste, so that he euthanizes them, but with a shovel in a really gory, horrible way that is just, again, it's not a violent movie, really. There's very little. The violence that we do see, it is a bit of a spoiler here, is purposely faked. It's play. It's like S&M. And we discover that later. So it's easily the most violent act in the movie, other than the murder, I guess. And it sort of just throws you off. It's not that it like scares you in the normal sense. It's just that it throws you off in this already strange movie. And the version that's streaming has been cut by almost 20 minutes, I believe. But I double checked and made sure this scene was in there and that they hadn't cut this out for some reason. So if you do watch the streaming version, you're still going to get this and the basic idea of it.
The chickens look like giant testicles.
Yes.
There's something really upsetting about the texture of their skin, and I was like looking at it, and I'm like, oh no, those are balls. And there's like one very quick gore shot of one that gets split open, and it just looks like it's like chow mein coming out. It's like, it doesn't even look like organs coming out. It's so gross.
It's like the idea is that it's just pure meat. There are the funny thing, because it is sort of a comedy. It's like a dark comedy. The funny thing about it is the idea that it would cost them so much more money to keep making these blobs, because they need to be like fed through tubes and stuff, that they might as well just keep doing the actual chickens and chopping their heads off. I should say Quisti didn't make a lot of movies, but he did one of the most two of the most artistic gialli in the early stage. He made this and The Possessed in 1965, which is also known as The Lady of the Lake, which is a complete opposite of this really melancholy black and white, super artsy murder mystery. And then the year after this, he made the weirdest and most horror-forward Italian Western in Django Kill If You Live Shoot, which is one of my all-time favorite movies. And it just as out there, but as this, but much more sadistic and much closer to a straight horror movie. I couldn't find a scene in that I thought was particularly scary, but I just wanted to plug Django Kill If You Live Shoot.
This means a great reduction in costs. It'll bring radical changes to production.
It'll change everything.
Let's notify the association at once. We must tell the president.
No one's going to be told. These are monsters.
I also have a giallo. For my number 65 scariest actual movie moment, I have The Fifth Chord from 1971, directed by Luigi Bizzoni. My personal favorite giallo that's not directed by Sergio Martino. Sergio Martino is my favorite, but this one, I think I've seen it like 6 times now. We talked about it when we talked about the giallo of 1971, so we've gone in great depth. Short of it is that the cinematography is by Vittorio Storaro, and he is just like one of the all-time great cinematographers. He won... he's a 3-time Academy Award winner. He did like Last Emperor and Apocalypse Now. And just every single shot of this movie is just jaw-dropping. It's incredible. And I'm not going to recap the plot because I don't understand the plot. I started watching this movie to prep for this, and I realized I've seen this movie like 4 times before, and I don't remember who the killer is. Doesn't matter. This scene stands alone as a self-contained scare. The scene in question involves this disabled woman, Sophia. She's played by Rosala Falk, and she's just like absolutely gorgeous and glamorous, but she has this like twerpy doctor husband who's just like, oh, you're disabled. What a burden. And she's like, please have sex with me. And he's like, gross. You're a beautiful woman in a bed. That's disgusting. So he goes off to work and leaves her all alone, and she's sort of all frustrated and depressed, and then she puts on this loud dramatic organ music. It looks like the Best of Dracula or something. It's just it's so intense, and then turns off all the lights, so she's just listening to like super intense pipe organ music as she stares into the fireplace thinking about how horrible her marriage is. And then suddenly the music cuts off and the whole house goes dark. And the only light is this fireplace that's inside the bedroom, and there's moonlight outside in the rest of the house. And so she thinks it's her husband coming back, and she calls to him, gets no reply, and then the phone starts ringing, and she has to go answer the phone. Why she wouldn't have the phone next to the end table? Well, then we wouldn't have this scene, so I'll forgive it because the scene's great. She crawls over the bed to her wheelchair, but she accidentally pushes it back into the shadows. And again, like you just have to picture the scene. The lighting is incredible. It's just like flickering orange lights from the fireplace and deep murky shadows everywhere. It's actually very similar to the opening scene in Mario Bava's Bay of Blood. But I think this does it one better. And it's a giallo film, so you know that someone is probably in the room with her. This is the first like on-screen murder, but you know what the deal is. So you're combing the room as well, but you can't see anything because all of the edges of the room are totally bathed in shadow. So she rolls out of bed onto the floor and she starts crawling towards the wheelchair, and it is the action she takes to crawl across the floor. It's like this super intense struggle for her to pull herself. And Rosala Falk like really is acting the hell out of it. And as she's just like inching across the bedroom floor painfully slowly, the camera is following her, but the camera is like obviously doing this like extremely smooth, graceful like dolly back. And the entire scene has camera work like this, and it's almost like it always reads to me like there's a cruelty to it, where it's like she's disabled, she's married to an asshole who leaves her alone, someone's going to murder her, she accidentally knocks this wheelchair away, and then the camera movements are mocking her as well because the camera's constantly like gliding and smoothly flying around the room.
Look what I can do.
Exactly. And so it's just sort of like emphasizing how helpless she is. I get it's like kind of mean-spirited the movie has this much glee in her suffering, but it's very effective. So what are you going to do? So eventually she does crawl over to the shadow at the edge of the room where her wheelchair was knocked, and the wheelchair isn't there anymore. And it's this great, like, oh, fuck, someone must have moved it. Who moved it? There's no one in the room. Is there someone in the room? And you can't see anyone. And, a lot of giallo have POV shots, but in this, we're just staying on her point of view. So you have no idea where the person is. She knows someone has to be in the room. She starts to panic. The phone starts to ring again, and it's on the other side of the room. So she has to turn herself around, and she has to like crawl all the way over to the table with the phone on it. And there's this really great shot that starts up of a close-up of the phone where it's ringing, and then it just dollies back really far to like emphasize, oh my God, she's never gonna make it. It's so far away. And she eventually gets there, and she the camera is like on her face, right? And so like we follow her hand going up the table to where the phone is, and the phone's not there. And it's like, okay, someone is just fucking with her at this point. Someone is like, literally, you couldn't pick a victim that is more helpless if you are a giallo murderer. And the thing about giallo murderers is they often murder. It's like, oh, the reason I was murdering was for this specific thing. It was like, you think it's a sex killer, sort of a compulsion sadism thing, and then at the end it's like, well, no, actually we needed the deed to the property or whatever. And it's like, you could just walk in there and strangle her, it's fine, but instead you just have this like really cruel figure that we haven't seen yet just mocking her. And she tries crawling over out of the room to the stairs, and she's up by the balcony, and she's calling out for her husband again. She needs help, and that's when the killer comes behind, strangles her, and then just like dumps her body over the balcony, and she just lands head first on the hardwood stairs with this really sickening thump. And so it's just this combination of really immaculate craft about the camera work and the lighting and the editing and everything, and also just like the cruelty of the whole thing. And of course, she acts the hell out of it. It's a solo piece, basically. Really, really scary scene. And I have grown to like giallo. I used to be the giallo skeptic, and I've kind of grown to like them. I generally am not that scared by giallo films. Yeah. They don't really tend to build suspense. It tends to be more just like over-the-top bombast in terms of the camera work and the style, rather than like calm, patient building of suspense and terror. But this is a case of just like a very scary scene in a giallo film.
Okay, so my number 64 is sort of a joke, but sort of not a joke. This is Magnolia from 1999, directed by Paul Thomas Anderson. This is a silly one. Paul Thomas Anderson's Altman-esque epic it's not a horror film. There's not a lot of violence in it. It features plenty of scary situations from like an emotional standpoint. That's kind of the whole point of it. But I'm not talking about any of these socially awkward situations or your father's dying existential crises. There's this thing that happens when you watch a lot of horror movies, and it's not a good thing. This is not me bragging. This is not me being, this is not machismo. Jump scares just don't work on me anymore. And it kind of sucks. It's just like I see them coming and then they happen. And when they do work though, it's super exciting. It's like, oh shit, they got me. I wasn't ready for that. And sometimes it's an accident. And so my little story here is that I saw this on DVD and I had just gotten my surround system. This was like the early days of affordable home surround systems. And if you've seen this movie, you know that the thing that thrusts the third act out, and it sort of starts the very long climax of the film, is it starts raining frogs. And the setup is trying to remember. It's John C. Reilly's character is a police officer, and he's driving, and it gets really quiet to the point where I thought I had messed up my new sound system that I just set up. And so I have the remote in my hand, and I'm turning it up, and I'm turning it up, and I'm turning it up. And then the first frog hits his windshield, and it's very loud, and I got jump scared, and I accidentally punched myself in the face with the remote. And it became my lasting memory of the Oscar-nominated favorite Magnolia. I remember this and the two Amy Mann songs, and I can't remember much else about what happens. So that's how it makes my number 64 scariest movie moment.
I will say the way Paul Thomas Anderson specifically shoots it, and especially the sound design, there is a really visceral physicality to the weight of the frogs.
Yeah.
It really does feel like you could die if you went out there. Like they're hitting with such impact. It's a pretty cool scene, and it's like in a different movie. even without just like that one thing being surprising because you don't expect it in the movie, like if it was a movie literally about like, oh, we are cursed and the biblical plagues are coming upon us and here's the plague of frogs, like that would be a pretty freaky scene. So I think it's a pretty good choice.
Well, thanks.
Personally, I find Julianne Moore's her scene with the lawyer scarier, but that's just because the overacting. It's so much. Number 63 is Dead of Night from 1945. It's a very early example of an anthology horror film from the British Ealing Studios, and that was a studio more known for comedy. And it's super rare in that it's a horror movie from England from the 40s, because horror movies were banned in England in the 40s. So the way it got away with it is it kind of smuggles the horror in with comedy, which is what the Ealing Studios were known for. And there's a lot about Dead of Night that's really cool. It's got a great framing device. It's really beautifully shot. But as I've watched it a couple times, it's actually become a movie I admire more than I actually enjoy, simply because so many of the segments are just not at all scary, and several of them are just outright dull. But the climax of the film is really, really incredible nightmare, and that's what I want to talk about. So it's an anthology horror film, and I haven't mentioned the director because all the different segments had different directors. And I wasn't able to get this 100%, but I'm pretty sure that the great Basil Dearden, who directed the framing device, also did the nightmare at the end. It's possible, because the nightmare goes through these different scenes of all the previous stories, it's possible that all of the directors shot their parts of the nightmare, but it feels such a complete thought that I think it is Basil Dearden, who's a great filmmaker. Look him up. The framing device is one of the coolest things about the movie. So it's about this architect, played by Mervyn Johns, who arrives at this country house where he's been asked to evaluate some renovations. He's never met anyone there, but upon arriving, he experiences intense deja vu because he claims he recognizes everyone at the house as part of a recurring dream he has. And the stories in the movie are all the other guests in the house relating weird and eerie experiences they've had, like as a way to make them feel better. And so it's like a lot of goofy stories about like, oh, premonitions of death, or there's ghosts arguing about golf, or it's a haunted mirror. There's one about a ghost at a Christmas party that's like fine. But finally, in the film's only scary story at the very end, there's like a very classic piece of ventriloquist dummy horror that ends with the dummy soul taking over the ventriloquist dummy's, the ventriloquist's body. And the people in the house, once they're done telling their story, someone breaks his glasses, and immediately that's followed by the light going out, which is how his recurring dream starts. So the architect immediately starts freaking out, and he asks to be left alone with a psychiatrist in a room. The psychiatrist says, go ahead, just talk to me, let it all out, we'll work through this. And at this point, because the lights are all out, it's very creepy. All the lighting comes from the fireplace. The camera is shot from these really low angles, and their shadows are cast in the wall behind them. It suddenly feels like a different kind of movie than it has been up to this point. And the architect explains that what always happens next in his dream is that he kills the psychiatrist, and that it's a shame that he broke his glasses because now he has no choice but to do so. He feels that it is his fate, it is destiny to do it. So he strangles the psychiatrist to death with his tie. And at this point, he sort of flies through this like hallucinatory nightmare that is a combination of all the other stories that have been told. And the way it's shot, it's just like really wild and stunning, especially like as a 1945 horror movie. You look at like what Universal horror was at that time, and it's like a lot of really tired like Wolfman and Frankenstein sequels. And in this case, it's just like really beautiful and nightmarish. And he's like running through the children at the Christmas party, and they're like, oh, we'll catch you, because they're playing hide and seek. And then he goes to like a ventriloquist dummy, and they're like, well, I've never been with a murderer. And it's like all of these things that all these stories become expressions of his guilt over having murdered. So it becomes this like whole crazy guilt nightmare. And this laughing crowd is all like mocking him, and they pick him up and they throw him into prison, and the guard is smiling and he winks at him, and they're all watching through the bars as the ventriloquist dummy, which was already in his cell, stands up and starts walking towards him and taunts him. And it's like, it's just so out of nowhere and intense, so much more intense than anything that's happened. And the dummy standing up is like shot from the back, so it's clearly like a child dressed as a dummy or whatever, but it's still very creepy and effective. And it starts to strangle him, and the camera pulls way back to reveal that like the prison cell exists in this total dark void. And then he wakes up, because that was a nightmare. It didn't actually happen. None of the thing that you just saw actually happened. It was all this architect's nightmare. The alarm goes off. He's got to get ready. He's got an appointment. But then as the end credits roll, you get to the really chilling part of the movie, which is all of the footage from the beginning of the movie of him driving and arriving at the country house is now playing again with the end credits rolling over it, implying this like recursive hell universe where he keeps waking up from a dream that is in fact still the dream, and he relives it over and over and over again. And it's like phenomenally cool structure for an anthology horror film. The idea that like they never cut to black when they're doing the credits, you just watch it play out. There's like potentially someone could edit a version of this movie that does just loop. That would be an interesting like art installation or something. Really, really bleak and frightening. And it's just like a movie that it just, because they couldn't really do an out-and-out horror movie, so little of it is actually very scary. Just that last 12 minutes really fucks you up. So Dead of Night from 1945 is my number 63 scariest, actual scariest movie moment.
I mean, this might actually be the first horror anthology. I don't know if there's some silent film thing.
The German movie Waxwork, I think, sort of counts as an anthology horror.
Well, either way, it's interesting that this early on we established that that your anthology movie has to end with the wackiest and most
That's
memorable
true.
thing.
All those, I mean, this was very influential on all those Amicus movies, and so that's why it always ends with, by the way, you're already in hell.
Right, exactly. And it predates the EC Comics that all those Amicus movies were also based on. So it had its influence for sure. Two other thoughts on here is that I had seen it so long ago and rewatching parts of it for this podcast. It reminded me there's another British film, and I looked it up, and it has nothing in common otherwise, called 3 Cases of Murder, which is a sort of anthology thriller. Have you ever seen that one?
I have not. It
ends with Orson Welles in a sort of nightmare situation that is more absurd and trying to be funny than this, and so there was part of me that was like, did some of it was a different studio, and we're talking 1955 at this point, but I was thinking there had to be somebody involved who was the same, but I couldn't find any connections there, unfortunately. But that's an interesting film. I gotta stop saying interesting. Everything's interesting. But the other thought I had was we're not going to cover it this episode, but there's another one that you picked for a later episode, and I just sort of looked at it and I said, I wonder if Patrick noticed how similar these two endings are, and so it's I guess that's just like a preview for a future episode that Patrick's going to cover something, and we're going to bring up how much it has in common with this particular pick.
Absolutely.
Just room for one more inside, sir. No.
Moving on to number 62, a 1943 horror movie, I Walked with a Zombie. We do already have a Val Lewton thing in here, don't we? Yes, we're going to have another Val Lewton thing. I wanted to have my own Val Lewton thing because Patrick picked the best one. This is directed by Jacques Tourneur and again produced by Val Lewton. This is part of those Lewton classic RKO horror films that were made for like no money, but are just the most evocative, awesome things that ever got produced. This is not one of my favorites of that series, but it just has, I'm kind of sticking with jump scares here for a minute. It just has this really simple, really well executed sort of jump scare where Francis D's character stumbles across a zombie that's just walking in what I think is a sugarcane field. It might be a cornfield, but I'm pretty sure it's a sugarcane field. And it's just sort of pitch black, and she just has a flashlight, and she's already spooked out because she's in an unfamiliar place with unfamiliar people and sort of pseudo supernatural happenings. And then there's just this man with big bug eyes just standing there right in front of her. And the punchline to the whole thing is that he's harmless. He just walks away again. But it's a very good early example of pulling off a jump scare in that you set up expectations, but you don't, what's the word? You don't announce to the audience to get ready for a jump scare.
I think this is like foundational, like jump scare 101. I think you watch The Nun, Go back to The Nun. Like watch a modern movie, like a horror movie. You are going to see jump scares that are staged this exact same way, where someone with a flashlight stumbles upon something that they don't quite know what it is, but then when they trail the flashlight up, then it reveals the scary face. Like this is the birth of that, and it's so perfectly achieved, and just all the cinematography, like all these movies it's just so impossibly beautiful and dreamy. When she's like taking that trip through that sugarcane field, it really feels like a fairy tale almost. It's really incredible. Number 61 is Vampire from 1932, directed by Carl Dreyer. It's kind of a strange movie. It straddles the line between silent and sound film. I think it was Carl Dreyer's first sound film, so he wasn't quite sure how to do it. So he sort of, especially, it was one of the early talkies where they were filming in multiple languages at the same time. So I think for just his own peace of mind, he mostly sort of stages it as a silent movie, but there's a full score, there are sound effects, but there's also like title cards giving exposition, and very little of the exposition is done through the dialogue. It's mostly title cards and stuff. So it's got this sort of weird half and half sort of a thing where it has a lot of the hallmarks of the silent era, but it still has like the eerie music of the sound era. And it has a really distinct look because it was shot on location, which most movies in 1932 were not really doing. And he shot it through pieces of gauze to try to like create a soft focus. So everything kind of feels a little distant and dreamy. And again, just very soft in a way that is very interesting, but also like if you watch a really nice version of this, you might still be like, damn, did they just not have a good print to recover? Because it's got a very strange look, but it's just because there's like no hard lines really anywhere, and it's this kind of movie where it's like it's just strange. You don't know what's happening or why it's happening a lot of the time. It's a story of a young man named Alan Gray, who's played by the film's producer Nicholas de Gunsberg, and he's ostensibly a student of the occult, but something that's almost immediately revealed is that he's kind of a scaredy cat, and the second he runs into things at this like rural hotel that are strange, he kind of like bolts his door and tries to not engage with any of it. He's
got a very slight Buster Keaton vibe about him.
Absolutely. Again, there's a little bit of that silent era comedy to his performance. And the nonverbal way he reacts to things. So it's got a sense of humor, but it's also very melancholy. The music is very mournful. And it's just absolutely full of really incredible trick photography. And there's like one sequence in particular where he like goes to this castle and he sees all these shadows that are walking around without owners. There's like shots where you see reflections in ponds, but there's no one casting a reflection, stuff like that, double exposures. So there's a lot of really cool, camera tricks, old school camera tricks that are used to create this supernatural atmosphere. But the scene I want to talk about is that I think is really the creepiest is at the end, and it's a lot simpler, which is at a certain point he is chasing this evil doctor, but he passes out on a park bench and he has this out-of-body experience, and his consciousness leaves his body and he walks over to a mortuary where he witnesses his own dead body in a coffin being prepared for burial by this evil doctor and a soldier who's helping him, and his corpse is like just stiff and dead, and his eyes are wide open, and the coffin's filled with flowers, and he has this really like gross pale makeup on, which it's just like one of the things about this movie is that Nicholas de Gunsberg is really hot. He kind of looks like a young prince, and when I say that, I mean Prince Nelson Rogers or whatever, but like also he looks like a young royalty. He's very well dressed, and like just the suits he wears are extremely well tailored and everything. So this whole time he's got this slightly gay, very handsome, very well put together feel. And then when he is dead in his coffin, he is just like mouth kind of slightly ajar. There's something slightly horrified about the look in his eyes, and he is dead in the coffin. He can't move. And what you'd get is his point of view inside the coffin as the lid is closed on it and screwed in place, but this lid has a glass window, so you still see out the top of the coffin as he is being buried. And so like you see the guy screwing the lid in place, you see a candle placed on the glass, and then you see the journey of the coffin as it travels out of the mortuary by the church, and the church bells are ringing. So there's just this very mournful kind of sound as the death toll kind of happens. Death knell, I should say. And eventually the coffin leaves the town, and then you see like just the tops of, or the bottoms of trees as it's going by these tree branches. And then you just see sky. And it's like that journey right there is him dying. That journey right there is him going, I'm leaving humanity, I'm leaving nature, and what is left for me now is just a total void. And it's very slow, and the sound is, again, strange because it's this early sound movie. And it's just kind of upsetting because obviously, like, the root of a lot of things that we find scary is that we're afraid to die. And because it's all these POV shots, you basically are forced to live out your own death and consider the loneliness of it. And there's a lot about this movie that's really cool, and there's a lot of like neat special effects, but that was the moment where I sort of stood up straight and I was like, oh Jesus, this is really unnerving. So that is my number 61 actual scariest movie moment.
Yeah, the loneliness of death. That's a good way of putting it. My next one, which I guess is number 60, is almost the complete opposite of that, except for I guess it's also in black and white. Man Bites Dog from 1992. Ugh. This is directed by, and oh man, French names, Remy Belvaux, Andre Bonzel, and Benoit Poelvoorde. I'm sorry, Benoit. I don't think... Yeah, sorry, I don't know how to say that name.
There are good pronunciation days and there are bad pronunciation days, Benoit.
At least I said Benoit, not Benoit, you know?
There you go.
It's the little wins that we got to take.
No one called him Benoit today.
I didn't call him Benoit. I knew what I was doing for a second there. Anyway, this is a mockumentary, and the first 2/3 of this movie are very, very funny. Very dark comedy, but very funny. Just a camera crew following around this obnoxious serial killer who you kind of get the feeling isn't even very good at being a serial killer. Like they've kind of picked the wrong guy. He's really full of himself. He's really annoying. He's the opposite of what you think a serial killer would be like, which is reserved, or at least at the time in the 90s, reserved, self-reflective, really sad, melancholic, maybe sadistic. This guy's like a party animal. Like he's like a bro. And the whole movie, he's sort of poking fun at the camera crew that's following him around. And slowly as the film goes on, they start to get sort of involved in the murders. Not directly at first, and it's very clear. There's a very clear message to this film, which is about the danger and inauthentic quality to documentary films, and that the documentarians are changing the narrative just by being there. But again, it's also just supposed to be funny. But the moment the whole movie turns is when they have a home invasion and they all sort of join in gang raping this woman, and it's like it stops being fun and it starts being disgusting. And as an audience member, you start to feel like shit for laughing at the earlier jokes where they killed elderly women and children, where like suddenly this is real. This isn't a good time anymore. And if you're watching the NC-17 cut, the quote unrated cut is actually a censored version. That was the easier to find version for a long time until Criterion put out their DVD. The NC-17 cut ends with sort of B-roll footage with no sound, just sort of, it's like not even a very good quality of just her gutted body. Just her body is just so mangled that it's just sort of gross meat and intestines. It's sort of clinical, and there's just no comedy or even drama behind it. It's just, this is what they've done. This is the end of the line. These guys are now also cursed. It's become contagious. They are bad guys. And there continues to be jokes throughout the movie. After this moment, it really kind of weighs on you. and it's very expertly done, even though it's really gross and mean-spirited.
Yeah, when I first got Netflix, original version, getting discs in the mail, this is teenage me trying to see fucked up shit. This is one of the first like transgressive movies I was able to get, and it was such a fucking bummer.
Yeah.
And when I say it, I mean this scene particularly, because it was the exact arc you talked about where I thought it was so funny and I thought it was so smart. And it's like I was definitely consuming it as like part of a Tarantino like charismatic hitman sort of a thing.
And it was sort of sold like that when it got its home video release. That was sort of the way that critics were talking about it.
And that scene burned into my memory forever. Just absolutely horrible.
André, Rémi, ça ne me rappelle rien, ça. Le vieux fusil.
Number 59 is Carnival of Souls from 1962. My personal favorite horror movie of all time. It's a kind of an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge story where a car goes off a bridge onto a river, and one of the passengers in the car climbs out of the wreckage hours later, and she's dead, but she doesn't know it yet. So
no, she's fine. She's fine.
It's just a scratch. So she moves to Utah to be a church organist, but the whole rest of the movie, she's stalked by this very deathly figure, played by the director, Herc Harvey. It's a very zombie-looking kind of makeup he has on. And I think that it's a movie that has a lot of open space. There's a lot of room for interpretation, but one of the reasons I connect to it is because it really works to me as a great expression of what depression is like, where this whole movie, she exists in this limbo and she wants to connect to people, but when they try to connect to her, she pulls away and she's torn between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And like Herc Harvey's the dead, and like all of the people around her in Utah are the world of the living. And she, in her travels through Utah, she sees in the distance the Saltaire Pavilion, which was a real abandoned resort. It went out of business in the 30s when lake water sort of receded from it. So much of the movie revolves around this location. And it's an absolutely amazing location. I think the origin of the movie is Herc Harvey going on a road trip and driving by it and just being like totally enamored with it. And he wrote a movie to work there, or
match it. Yeah.
It's a different screenwriter. Herc Harvey didn't write the screenplay, but at any rate, it's sort of the reason the movie exists, and it's really spectacular. And it exists as this metaphor for Mary herself, because it's this destination that promises amusement and fun and recreation, but it's just totally dead, and it's fallen into disrepair, and there's an inherent tragedy into an abandoned amusement park. Because it's just sort of a reminder how all life ends and how all the fun eventually will die. She goes to it for the first time, but she's there with her boss, who is a priest, so he's not going to trespass to go inside. So later in the movie, she goes in, and that's the scene that like really sticks with me, because it is this kind of silent movie scene where she's trespassing on this location. And it becomes very Michelangelo Antonioni-esque, where the character is sort of dominated by this really hostile environment. Like all the shots are these very long shots where these, buildings and walls and structures are sort of looming over her. And the music is great. It's, she's a church organist, so the music in the movie is all pipe organs, and it all kind of feels like it's coming out of her head. Gene Moore does the score, and it's absolutely spectacular. And in this sequence, the organ starts doing this slow, almost like mocking carnival waltz as she's wandering through these tunnels and abandoned buildings. And the cinematography is really hard to overstate just how beautiful it is, especially because it is like this super, super low budget, cheapy 60s movie. They just happen to do a spectacular job with the cinematography. Maurice Prather was the cinematographer. And so as she's walking, there's all these like really great long shadows, and there's all these slats of wood casting stripes against her. And the thing that is sort of eerie about it is that she isn't creeped out by it. She's like comforted by it. Like as she walks around, she feels at home. It's not someone abandoning it's not someone exploring a scary place and like the tension is what's going to jump out. The thing that's eerie about it is that it's like the first time in the movie we see her like genuinely at peace. There's at some point she walks to the back of it and she's looking down at the lake. She picks up a rock and tosses it into the shallow water, and then it cuts to a close-up of the rock landing where Herc Harvey's sort of zombie figure is sleeping. And it's like she doesn't notice. She doesn't notice he's there. She doesn't know he's dead. or she doesn't know that she's dead. She's wandering around this place, totally not understanding why it's connecting to her the way it is. And as a movie that when I watch it, I tend to connect it to my own depression. Like, this pavilion almost like represents why I watch movies like this, or why I watch, horror movies in general. Is like, there's something comforting about dark material. There's something very comforting about stories that confront death. There's something very comforting about acknowledging that fear. And it's just sort of combination of the score and the cinematography and the location and just that fact that it's not scary, even when it's the scene that's supposed to be scary. That's very eerie, because it's just the dramatic irony of, like, you don't even know. You think everything is fine. You don't even know why you like this place. It's really, really cool, but it also is, like, kind of eerie in a way that I think also should belong on this list. You don't necessarily need to be disturbed or shocked by a movie. Sometimes a movie just sort of sticks with you forever because there is something kind of off about it, and that's kind of what this movie's like for me.
And that's actually sort of goes into my number 58, which is another movie that just sort of sticks with you and doesn't have a lot of specifically scary scenes, so I struggled a little bit including it on here, but it is Eyes Without a Face, directed by Georges Franju. This is from 1960, and Patrick and I covered it pretty extensively. A couple years ago, we did a two-part episode on the horror movies of the year 1960, which I believe is like the best year for horror movies, just barely, but it has just enough bangers that it ekes out years like 1968, for instance. Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to go into it too much here, but Eyes Without a Face is the one movie that we covered that I think might be able to freak out young modern audiences. I think as they go into it not really knowing what to expect, that it has such a intensively strange and upsetting atmosphere about it that I think they could vibe with it. I think the youngins could vibe with this one.
Also, it's a movie with gore.
Yeah, and it's and there's like two movies from that era that had genuine gore, and this is one of them. And I think that in this case, the gore kind of, it's done in a way where they're skirting a censorship, I believe. I don't know if France had very specific on the books ways that they dealt with censorship of violence at the time, but I'm sure Franju knew that there was a possibility of being censored. So the idea here is that it's a very B movie plot where there's a mad scientist basically who's kidnapping young women in an effort to repair his daughter's face, which has been irreparably scarred. And so he is kidnapping, murdering people, and trying to graft their faces onto his daughters. And around the middle of the movie, there's this sort of pause in the action, and it serves multiple purposes. So the first thing is that it's gross. And so there's this sickly clinical view of all these attempted failed skin grafts. And this includes a pretty graphic face removal scene that I've seen on those YouTube lists of most disturbing moments in old movies. So that's another reason why I think the kids could get with this one. But for me, it's the even more clinical look at the progressive rot of the failed grafts, and it's interesting because they don't shoot it as like Franju doesn't want to cover a bunch of all the days it takes for her face to rot back off again. So it's these still photographs that the doctor is basically looking at, and it's very cold. And these images of this poor woman whose face we don't see, and this is like the reveal of her face, if I remember correct, because she's wearing a mask the rest of the time because her face is so rotted. So the first view we get of what her face looked like before the accident is in one of these clinical photos of the skin graft, and we get to see the progressive re-rotting of her face. And the scene also works to establish that she has had no say in any of this, which is there's an interesting lack of agency on her part that, and for the first part of the movie, feels like she's sort of complicit in this because she wants a new face. But as this goes on and this scene is sort of kicks off the fact that maybe this isn't what she wants, and she's just sort of going along with it. But the way the scene shows how awful these deaths are because they're wasted, it just sort of leaves you feeling cold and sort of dried out at this point in the movie. And then again, it's only like halfway done, and there's just, it allows the movie to get more dreamlike and surrealistic and strange and esoteric as it goes on.
Yeah, for sure. It kind of reflects, like, as her humanity becomes less and less apparent as, like, the skin of her face rots away, that, like, sort of mirrors the way that she as a person has grown more and more distant from her father as she, like, sort of disassociates from her situation and, like, just the absolute horrible things he's doing. That sequence, it's a really great moment in that movie. Very, very unnerving.
15 février. 20 février.
Number 57 is The Thing from Another World from 1951, which is either directed by Kristen Nyby or Howard Hawks, or both of them, depending on which take you listen to. At any rate, it's a very Howard Hawks movie, and it's one of my favorite 1950s horror films. And I feel like on any given day, you could flip a coin, and I might like it more than John Carpenter's The Thing, which I know is like sacrilege.
Blasphemy.
I know.
Dare.
It's just like, that's my taste. But I'm never going to say that it is a scarier movie than John Carpenter's The Thing. Like, the monster in it is like kind of a neat looking thing, but he's also just sort of like a lumbering 7-foot vegetable man. It's fine. Yeah. But there is a scene in it that's extremely scary, but it's more scary because you're like afraid for the lives of everyone involved in the making of the movie. So at some point, the monster has escaped. It all takes place in an Arctic base. I don't need to explain The Thing to you. A monster has escaped, and it's radioactive, so they have a Geiger counter that starts clicking as it gets closer, and it's kind of like this, it's a progenitor to the motion sensor in Aliens, and they know it's coming for them because it's clicking faster and faster. So you get this really great Howard Hawks sequence where they're quickly trying to put together a plan. They're like, well, look, the cold doesn't kill it because what about fire? Okay, well, how do we do fire? Kerosene. I have a bucket over here. All right, you get the bucket. We need one more bucket. I got one over here. Okay. And it's like there's all this overlapping dialogue, and it's that Howard Hawks sort of philosophy of like people like watching professionals do their jobs. And so much of this movie is like, what if the scientists and military people that are in all these 1950s sci-fi movies, like, what if you actually respected them and the job they were doing? And that's like all it really takes to make it work really well. So at a certain point, you have this long take where they're getting ready in the room, and the thing's clicking faster and faster, and the guy's reading out the Geiger count to sort of emphasize how close it's coming. He goes, turn off the lights. So the camera sort of lowers itself a bit, and they turn off the lights, and there's a door in the background that you know it's going to burst through. And it does. It bursts through, but it takes about like 90 seconds of preparation in this one long take before it bursts through the door. And when it does, it is this like giant 7-foot monster silhouette, which is really cool. But someone throws a bucket of kerosene onto it, and then someone else shoots a flare gun at it. And the entire monster goes up in flames, like during the same shot that you've already been watching. But also the wall behind it goes up in flames because that also got soaked with the kerosene when they threw the bucket of water. And because they turned off the lights, the room is dark, and the flames it's a black and white movie. The flames are just like blinding streaks of white that are just taking up most of the frame. And it looks totally out of control. And at this point, there are a few cuts or whatever, but it's they did this in multiple takes. But like, it still has the fluid motion that it's all happening at once. It's like swatting at a stuntman. It knocks one over. Someone throws another bucket of kerosene while it's still on fire. And it's just one of those things, like, all the actors are so close to it. There's just balls of fire coming off of it in all directions. You can see the ceiling, so you know it's a closed set of some sort. It's just like, if I was a part of this production, I would just be panicking. I would say, like, oh my God, we're going to kill all of our actors. They're in a union. Like, the union frowns upon when you burn all of the actors to death. You're like, can any of these people breathe? Is all the oxygen getting sucked out of the room? As at a certain point, the actress Margaret Sheridan is hiding behind this like mattress, and it swats at it. And when it swats, its claws tear open the mattress, and in the tear, a flames alight. And it's like it swats like a streak of flames. Carves it into the mattress. There's all these shots like this where so many fire stunts in movies are like, okay, we put the actor in the safety suit, we set him on fire, he's going to run from screen left to screen right, fire extinguishers done. But in this, he's interacting with so many things. And then there's a third bucket of kerosene, which you didn't even know anyone had filled. And it douses the entire wall behind him in a massive wall of flame. And this is a foot away from Margaret Sheridan was. It's probably at this point a stunt double. But like the implication is that they might have just set their friend on fire. And then finally, when the entire room is a burning inferno, it jumps through a window into the snow to extinguish itself and runs away. But it's just like, for any era, it's an insane stunt. I love fire stunts. They're so impressive to me. And I love when a horror movie pops up with a good fire stunt. And I don't think it's ever been topped. But like, especially in the world of 50s sci-fi, so much of what happens is so sort of hermetic and sanitized. Like if there's a human scale monster, the monster chokes someone. You never see like people being torn apart by claws or anything because it's the 50s. And if it's like a giant kaiju-sized monster, then it's like, well, that's Ray Harryhausen's job. He was off totally somewhere else doing it. The danger never feels that immediate in these kinds of movies. There's a few exceptions. I think Them, which is already on one of the, I think that was on the Shudder list, but it might have been on the Bravo list. Them is a very good example of a monster movie where the monsters feel vicious and real and interact with the humans. But like, the way that the fire is just so immediately fills the entire frame with a blinding white, it's extremely scary. But maybe it's scary in a way that like sometimes you watch Hong Kong action movies and you go, I think that stuntman just broke his neck.
Yes. Or Italian action movies, and they crash a car, and they're like, I think 5 people just died. Not even involved in the production. Well, the interesting thing about this scene is it's one of the handful of scenes that John Carpenter directly references in his version.
Oh, that's right.
Is super proud. I think the Carpenter one held a record for a while for the longest complete full body burn. But even with all his skill and breaking records, the Carpenter version is not as intense as the original version because it still sort of feels like a movie and not insane people that didn't plan things out that are maybe going to kill their friends in real life.
You almost actually go like, I'm Johnny Knoxville, and this is the thing from another world. Like it feels like a stunt more than it even feels like a scene in a movie. It's so dangerous, but also contextualized in a way that you feel the fear for the characters. So it's not necessarily like it takes you out of the movie, but it is just totally spectacular. So Thing from Another World, that is my number 57.
So we're going to get into the modern era again for a second here, break away from black and white movies. For 56, Princess Mononoke from 1997. This is, of course, directed by Hayao Miyazaki. I wanted to cover as many shades of fear as I could with my list, and I remembered a specific moment from this movie when I was thinking this through. So I guess this is probably Miyazaki's second most popular movie. I think that Spirited Away is the most popular one, at least outside of Japan. I don't know what the standings look like in Japan, but it is sort of a culmination of a certain brand of anti-war apocalyptic fantasy adventures that he told, and he would sort of stack these between much more lighthearted children's movies. Throughout his career, he did this, and he would do he sort of began this with Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, which is an okay movie and an incredible top 10 all-time comic book that everybody should read. Then he sort of, if you're going movie-wise, he took it a step further with Laputa, the Castle in the Sky, which I think is the best movie version of this kind of thing. But Princess Mononoke is bigger and more epic and much more adult than that movie. And I think this is basically him going full R-rated with it, even though the Weinsteins managed to secure a PG-13 because it's a cartoon, and the MPA is more lenient on cartoons. But it's a very violent movie that opens with the hero using his cursed arm to shoot an arrow from a bow and rip the dude's arms off with it. Like, very graphic scene to sort of start the movie and sort of set the pace. And then there are all these really disturbing shots of these giant god animals, which are just like regular animals but very large, and they get covered in this cursed demon goo, basically. So in a lot of ways, without really thinking it through too hard, I think this is the closest Miyazaki ever got to making a horror film. But I'm not really counting any of those scenes. The thing, trying to be eclectic with my brand of fear here, The scene for me is in the middle of the movie. Something so shocking happens that it's what always sticks with me when I think about the movie. And in the scene, we're being left in awe of this majestic forest spirit that we've been told about throughout the movie, and which the bad guys are hunting because they think its head will give them some sort of power. And it's this beautiful yet uncanny beast with sort of a human face, and it's this perfect Miyazaki thing where it's kind of grotesque but beautiful at the same time. And at this moment that we're shown this, we sort of believe that the good guys will overcome. And at the peak moment of grace, a bullet rips from off screen and decapitates it. And the head tumbles off, and it's still sort of grinning, and it just bleeds this toxic rot all over everything. And the initial shock of the head being shut off is a big deal, and I remember just gasping the first time I saw this movie. And they actually totally ripped this off for one of those Snow White movies, those sort of actiony snow. They just ripped it off wholesale for, I think it was the first one, Snow White and the Huntsman. I think that's what it was called.
Yeah.
I remember gasping, but for me, the real fear factor is that it is a point of no return, and we know that this is going to lead to some like apocalyptic shit, and it hasn't happened yet, but we know it's coming, and characters can't stop it. And this will come up again later, and I think the last episode, there's a moment in a different movie where this happens that freaks me out even more. But there's some sort of, there's a certain brand of dread that comes along with this kind of shit, that's the moment that the good guys lost, and there's still like half an hour, 40 minutes of movie left, so we know things are about to get much worse.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There is a very specific feeling as an audience member when you feel the point of no return has been broached.
It's something that good superhero movies do. I don't think we've seen it a lot lately, but it is something that good superhero movies do, where we're established that these people are heroes and they're good and they're righteous, and the bad guys are bad, and so they're going to lose. And then the bad guys do something to turn the tide in a way that the reader or audience cannot fathom them getting out of this situation.
For sure. And also Miyazaki has that thing that Spielberg has where you feel the gentle humanism behind everything. And so when they go dark, they're able to be extra shocking.
Yeah.
Does. He never feels like there's a lot of anime that's way more violent than Princess Mononoke, but so much of that anime just feels like, well, yeah, it's violent anime. It's trying to rub your face in it. And every time something really horrifically violent happens in a Miyazaki movie, it always feels like it always hits especially hard because everything else around it has so much grace and humanism behind it. Number 55 is My Bloody Valentine from 1981, directed by George Mihalka. George Mihalka? You have to say it like that, too. There's a question mark at the end of his last name.
Yeah.
So, I think, when it comes to meat and potatoes, coloring inside the lines, not changing the game at all kind of slasher movies, My Bloody Valentine is as good as it gets. It is just an excellent example of why the formula works. And there's a lot of things to recommend it. It has really good gore. I think the photography is quite nice. And it has a really, really good setting, which is this mine. And I think it's just a really good horror movie location because you have this, sense of danger to it. Obviously, mines are very dangerous. Claustrophobia to it. There's a labyrinthian kind of quality to it. When people go into the mine, there's the feeling that they can get lost and never come out. So there's almost a sense of Greek myth to a mine. And then we have characters being separated from each other. So it's just a very effective slasher movie location. And it's lit perfectly in this movie because there's a lot of slasher movies that take place in a forest or something, and it's hard to light a forest and everything is too dark, and then you never know geographically where anything is, and it just kind of nothing registers because you can't establish the geography of the situation. But the mine is very dark and foreboding while never being just too dark to see shit. And there's just a lot of excellent slasher craft on display in this movie, especially the unrated version. This is a movie I did not like the first time I saw it because I saw the R-rated cut. And as soon as I was able to see the proper version with the gore restored in the Blu-ray, I was like, oh, okay, no, this is a beautiful, like, really well achieved movie. So at this point, this is the climax of the movie. There's been a ton of murders, super gory and violent. The threat is very real. They know that the killer is in the mine with them. There's the 4 leads, the 2 females, the 2 male. They have to escape. They run to the elevator, but the killer has smashed the control panel. So instead, they are forced to climb up the elevator shaft. And I have a horrible fear of heights. I really have a bad fear of heights.
Me too.
Ladders are just like incredibly scary objects to me. Even a small ladder, like the idea of climbing a 10-foot ladder really freaks me out. It just feels like it's way too easy to fall off and die. And I think statistically, hey, so many injuries happen on ladders. It's a reasonable fear.
I had a thing where we had a 1-story house growing up, and if something needed to be done on the roof, I was so afraid of ladders that I had actually figured out a way to climb a tree and go over onto the roof, which is way more dangerous. But I just hated ladders so much that I was willing to put myself in that danger to avoid. I was more willing to die falling out of a tree than I was hurt my back falling off a ladder.
So, like, they are being chased by a killer. The threat is very real. The gore is horrific. They're going to die. They're going to die in a really nasty way. In this dark, damp mine. And they have to climb this, 100-foot. You don't even see the top of the ladder. For all you know, they are 300 feet below the earth. It is like an endless ladder for all you're concerned. And it's dripping with water for some reason, which means that it's slippery. So it's this 100-foot rusty ladder dripping with water. And it's a movie that has a really good costume for the killer. The pickaxe is a really good weapon. Again, the scare sequences, the kills are very well staged. But the scariest thing in the movie is that fucking ladder. And there's the one friend who's already kind of in panic mode because she witnessed her boyfriend get murdered in front of her. She's freaking out, and she has 2 people under her on the ladder as they're all climbing up. So she has to keep pace. She can't go back down. And she's freaking out, and she's crying, and she's stopping, and the others are trying to get her to keep going, and they're calling out to the guy in the front being like, hey, slow down. She keeps stopping. And so there's even an element of social anxiety where she knows she's potentially could be the reason that her friends die as well. And it's just every once in a while when you're watching a slasher movie or a horror movie in general, there'll be a situation and you can point to the screen and go, yep, that's me.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not the hero.
Yeah. A lot of there's a lot been made of oh, they're so stupid. Why'd they go into the haunted house that's clearly haunted? Why didn't they leave? Why did they go up the stairs instead of going out the front door? But sometimes I love a horror movie where a character does poorly because I know I would do poorly in that exact same situation. And this is one of those where I am totally locked in, totally 100%. Wow, cinema is an empathy machine because it's I'm on that ladder and I'm sobbing and my friends are trying to reason with me, but also there's a panic to their voice and they're kind of pissed. So it's just already a really scary scenario, and then there's this sort of awkward social situation to it, and then just when they're near the top, that's when the corpse of a character that was killed earlier in the movie falls down the shaft with a noose around his neck, and his neck is all cut up, so the impact of him landing on the noose pops his head off, and all the characters get splattered with blood, and his decapitated body, we get a shot of it falling down, so you see they are 80 feet up. It takes 5 seconds for it to hit the ground and with a sickening thud. And now you know that our dear woman, who is the most scared of all, she gets the biggest blast of blood. Her face is totally fucking covered with it. So then they all have to hurry back down. And this time they know the killer is above them because before they just knew there was a killer in the mine somewhere. And now they're like, oh my God, he's above us. And so the pressure is even stronger. And then at the end of the scene, you get a good little payoff shot of the severed head dripping with nerves and veins, just dangling on the rope above them. Great. It's just a really good scare. It's just one of those things where it's bad situation. Let's turn the screw, make it worse, and then let's turn the screw, make it worse, and then let's turn the screw, make it worse. All of the best really good traditional suspense sequences in horror movies like these are good at out of the frying pan into the fire sort of stuff, and this is one of those.
I don't want to go any further! Please, can we stop going in the way? There's no other way! Now move it, damn it!
We'll move on to my number 54. is yet another movie I already covered on this podcast. Not too long ago, Betsy and I did a horror movie for kids. No, sorry, this wasn't even part of that. Before that, Tyler and I did a Legacy sequel episode, and I really wanted to cover this. A Return to Oz from 1985, directed by Walter Murch. I'm actually really surprised this wasn't on the Shudder list, because this is one of those movies that suddenly a bunch of young people saw. When I say young people, I mean like people in their teens and 20s just suddenly saw this movie that all of us late stage Gen Xers and millennials saw as actual children, and then just disappeared because of Disney kind of burying it, and also it having other distribution issues. So it's this sort of like pseudo lost movie that made no money when it was released and was way too scary. And so they ended up having to put a special warning on the, even though it got a PG rating, they had an extra warning on the posters. And like it's actually, I put this next to Princess Mononoke, because Princess Mononoke, when it was released in U.S. theaters, a bunch of stupid idiots took their children to see it because they heard that it was this award-winning Japanese animated film, and then it was rated PG-13, but then they all complained it was too violent for their kids. So this was a case of movie that was being designed to be a children's movie, and just every choice made is the scariest fucking thing you've ever thought of, and why would you do this? And it really is like in the era of creepypasta. Like, it feels like 1985 creepypasta by accident, trying to make a children's movie, sticking maybe a little too close to the source material, which is pretty shocking in a lot of ways.
Everyone I know who saw this movie as a child has the same story about how this is the scariest thing that traumatized them as a child.
And the thing is that I can't speak for those other people, but as someone who was a very fearful child and could not deal with horror, this scared the shit out of me, but I really liked it and wanted to watch it again. So there's some real value in it, that it is a horror movie for children that treats them with enough respect to scare them, but is still somehow speaking to them. But anyway, there's a million choices here of scary things I could do. But the obvious choice, this is a case of me not avoiding the obvious. The obvious choice is that the really fucked up scene where Dorothy Gale, played by a young Fairuza Balk, which is another reason this now has a cult following, because Fairuza Balk became a cult actress. She has to steal the powder of life from Princess Mombi. And Mombi is this sort of vain witch who's also sort of a governess, because it's a post-apocalyptic movie in a way, that Dorothy has come back to Oz after this sort of takeover from the Goblin King. And Mombi has sort of been put in place to take charge of things. And Mombi's thing is that she beheads beautiful women and girls and keeps their heads and then wears them interchangeably, depending on how she feels that day, basically. And she keeps all the heads in this corridor of glass cases with just heads in them, sleeping heads. And so in the scene, Dorothy has to go down the hallway, open up the case where Mombi's real head sleeps, and steal the powder of life. And while she's doing it, Mombi wakes up, starts screaming at her. All the other heads start screaming, and Mombi's body minus head gets up and starts chasing her. And it's sort of campy in a way, I suppose, but it is super intense for a child, and the music is blaring on the soundtrack. And I feel like in a different universe, James Whale lived to be like 1,000,000 years old, and he was handed this movie by Disney, and this is what he made. Like, it feels like if he was alive in 1985, this is the kind of thing he would have made. And again, I'm surprised this didn't make the list. The Bravo Scariest Movie Moments did have the original Wizard of Oz, which I feel like they included because, that movie freaked out people, the flying monkeys. I don't think that the original Wizard of Oz has near the scare power of Return to Oz, or really the original stories for that matter.
Yeah, absolutely not. It's so much.
Dorothy girl.
Number 53 is Winter Beast from 1992. Now, on the last episode, I talked about Shakma, which is often considered one of the notorious bad movies, but nonetheless, I found it scary. Hey, guess what? Winter Beast is one of those so bad it's good rediscoveries that happened recently, and it's directed by Christopher Thies, and it is, in fact, an extremely low-budget monster movie. It was shot over the course of 5 years in the 80s in Western Massachusetts, and after all that time, it was only about 70% done, so the producer, who is also a professional stop-motion animator, patched it together with a bunch of weird stop-motion monster scenes. So it's notorious for just having, a shit ton of weird monsters that pop up in one scene and never again, and it's very silly, and it's very amateurish. It's very clearly like friends goofing off, having a good time, and by the time you get to the third act, that's when they sort of ran out of money and the plot becomes impossible to follow. And so when I say it's oh yeah, Winter Beast is great, it's great because it has that rough homemade charm. It's not great because it's super scary or anything. But there's a thing about expectations. And when you have expectations for this is going to be a goofy weirdos, making a strange thing with their friends, you don't expect anything scary to happen. So when the one scene in this movie that comes out of nowhere is scary, it is absolutely terrifying. And so in this story, there's this owner of a resort lodge that kind of functions like the mayor in Jaws, where there's all these monster murders happening, and the park rangers want to shut down the mountain, but it's a tourist attraction, and he won't let them shut down the mountain. Now, he owns a hotel. He is not the mayor, so he doesn't actually have this power. It's just one of those things. It's this movie doesn't make any sense. But this owner, who is definitely the most memorable actor in the movie up to this point, there is a scene where he is alone in the lodge, and he has this sort of creepy ventriloquist dummy kind of grin just plastered onto his face. And he is moving extremely slowly towards a record player, and he just looks kind of deranged, and his eyes look kind of weird, and he just has this giant smile that's totally not moving at all. And he puts on the record player, and it's a children's novelty record called Oh Dear, What Can the Matter Be? And he starts to lip sync it to no one. No one else is in the lodge with him, but he just sort of prances around, lip syncing to this very strange novelty song from, it sounds like, the 40s. And then at this point, the movie is just whatever narrative momentum we were trying to achieve, this not only doesn't connect to anything before it or after it, it is just a thing that happens in the middle of this movie, totally unexplained. He's gesturing like a conductor as he's lip syncing to this weird kiddie song. And
I just want to add that it's a child's voice singing really adds something to it. It's
That's
a novelty
true.
song. It's literally being sung by children, in case that wasn't, or a child, in case that wasn't clear.
No, that's very important. Good point. And so there's the implication that in some way he is regressing to being a little boy or something. And he turns to this very creepy clown mask that's on the wall, and he has this crazy smile on his face. And then suddenly he kind of stops and his face starts to slacken. And the shot, and again, it's a movie that it's mostly shot with a single key light on studios. It's the lighting is not very strong throughout this, but this one shot looks incredible. Half of his face is in shadow and the other half is lit, and he's looking slightly off camera, and his face just goes completely blank as he stares at this clown mask. And it's like the human that he is pretending to be goes away for a second, revealing the sociopath underneath. And it's just the whole movie, it's some of the worst acting you've ever seen in your life. And so when you encounter this extremely effective physical performance that happens, it is so shocking and so creepy. And the camera just holds on his dead, blank, lifeless face for 10 seconds. And there's something that happens in a lot of Stephen King novels. The way he conceives of evil, often when he writes about evil characters, he'll describe a certain inhuman blankness coming over a person's face. Like in the movie Misery, Annie Wilkes, or in the book Misery, Annie Wilkes will be described as just sort of logging off for a couple seconds and not processing anything that's happening around her, and then suddenly snapping back into her little folksy personality. And that's absolutely what happens here. And then very slowly the smile comes back, and he puts on the clown mask, and he walks over, and then later some heroes, the heroes of the movie show up, and they witness him, and now he's doing the same song and dance, but it's in a room full of decomposing corpses, and he's smoothing their hair, so it's kind of like if Ed Gein did a drag show. It's so fucking weird, but it's especially scary because it came after 50 minutes of just silly, goofy monster movie with funny little stop motion clay guys, and then what the fuck? And then afterwards, it's like it never happened. And then it becomes a silly little goofy movie with stop motion action, like stop motion clay monsters. It's so surprising and shocking. It was like the thing. The first time I saw this movie, I was not prepared for it. And I couldn't really put my finger on what it was, but this is the scene I walked out of going like, I think there's something here. I think Winter Beast is more than just a so bad it's good, which is a phrase I don't like using, but like there's something else to it that kind of works, and it's just a very scary scene in a movie that's generally not.
I haven't seen this. You sent me the clip, and it just made me want to crawl out of my skin. I just wanted to leave the room. I wanted to crawl behind the couch. I wanted to bury my head in a pillow. It's just like it's so upsetting and uncanny and fucked up, and just and to hear that it doesn't even have context in the movie makes it even worse.
It really does.
All right, carrying it back to the Gialli well for number 52. And this is another Lucio Fulci movie, and this is the last one I'll do. I could have made a bunch of Lucio Fulci things. They don't usually actually scare me, but I love talking about them. There are certain Fulci movies where it's just an absolute piece of shit movie, but there'll be one scene that makes it all worthwhile, especially in his later career. But this is his earlier career. Don't Torture a Duckling, 1972. He made this in a sort of row with some other Giallo movies, and he stopped making Giallo and became a horror movie director for a while there. But it was his third following Perversion Story, which is AKA One on Top of the Other of Another, which is very poppy, fun. So it has a sort of bummer ending, but is otherwise a very like mod friendly rock and roll movie. And then he followed that up with the very surrealistic Lizard in a Woman's Skin, which was we covered in the 1971 Giallo episode, so I won't go into that one too much. But that one does represent an escalation in violence, because there's this fucked up scene where the protagonist randomly stumbles in a room full of these sort of gutted, trussed up dogs that are some sort of medical experiment, and it's never really explained if she actually saw it. And that's a freaky scene, but otherwise, that movie's still pretty poppy. This is a major escalation, and it's also deeply cynical, depressing, subversive movie that accidentally ties into the themes of City of the Living Dead, but I'll talk about that in a minute. The story here revolves around child murderers in a rural area of Italy. The main suspects include a, quote, loose socialite who is laying low in town to escape her drug charges, a reporter from the big city, played by Tomas Milian, and these are both outsiders, so because they're outsiders, they are suspected as bad people. And then there is a pagan hermit named Marciara, played by Florinda Boltkin, who was the lead of Lizard in a Woman's Skin. And she is the person who this insular, superstitious, small-minded townsfolk have deemed a witch. And the witch confesses to the murders, but it is a misunderstanding, because she thinks she has cursed these boys because she doesn't like them because they're naughty, and she thinks her curses have worked and she killed them. And as soon as the authorities realize that that's what's going on, they release her, and they say, "Oh, you didn't actually kill these children. These children were murdered by hands. You're fine." In the scene that I've chosen, the townspeople, unconvinced of her innocence and blinded by their righteous fury, follow her to a local graveyard where they brutally beat her to death with chains and 2x4s. And Fulci loves to use gore for fun, but also to drive home a point. And that's where it connects to City of the Living Dead, because sometimes his intentions are entirely muddled, because the head drilling scene in City of the Living Dead was supposed to represent a sort of a cry against misplaced vigilantism gone too far. But it's so over the top, and it's part of such a weird movie that it feels like it's just the effect of hell bleeding into our world. Don't Torture a Duckling makes the same point in a much more coherent manner, because we know the victim is innocent, and we know how much it hurts to be beaten with chains and 2x4s. We've never vomited up our own intestinal tracts, and most of us haven't had our head drilled all the way through. But a lot of us have been hit by something similar to a chain, and we can appreciate the pain of that. And the scene is also strikingly modern in that the killers play the radio loudly to drown out her screams, but she doesn't actually end up screaming very much. But they crank up the radio, and so we get this sort of diegetic. Is that the right one? Is it diegetic or
Yeah.
Diegetic? Yeah, we get this diegetic music that even has introductions from a DJ. So the first part of the scene is set to funk music, and I firmly believe that this is what Tarantino was referencing when he used Steelers Wheel for Reservoir Dogs' ear-cutting scene. I absolutely think Fulci, as someone who seeked out all these Tarantino, as someone who seeked out these Fulci movies, had to have had this somewhere in his mind, because the idea of playing upbeat music to brutality is so similar, and the fact that it's on the radio and there's even DJ introductions. The rest of the scene is more Sergio Leone-esque because it starts playing melancholic kind of aria, but this first part has always struck me as really modern, and it's a breathtaking, really brutal scene. Fulci fans will talk about their favorite gore scenes, and this one almost unequivocally comes up as the one that they don't actually enjoy because it feels too real and upsetting. And he even did the chain beating again in The Beyond, which is maybe I would say a superior movie. It does not carry the same weight in The Beyond as it does here.
Yeah, it's so brutal and upsetting, and it is this very specific balance between the violence being heightened and the way it is shot and edited being this sort of larger-than-life murder, but also being like very visceral and very personal and very real and minor. So it isn't like you said, the giant drill in the head in City of the Living Dead or something like that. It's very unpleasant, and that's something I really appreciate about Fulci, is that he knew how to weaponize unpleasant violence in different ways. And
yes,
it's not all just like rubbing your face in the awfulness of humanity. Sometimes violence in his movies are upsetting, and they sort of have a completely different meaning to it. But like there is an intention behind the violence. It's not just, let's think of 5 great ways to kill people.
A lot of bad things that make me mad. Your loving keeps me so ready.
Number 51 is Godzilla from 1954, directed by Ishiro Honda. Now, Godzilla is a movie that completely informs my understanding of what genre even is. Obviously, there's a lot of people who are much smarter than me who have written extensively on the subject, but I can't read academic books on genre, so I don't know. So my own theory is built on Beast from 20,000 Fathoms and Godzilla, because they're more or less the same movie. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms is the 1953 Hollywood monster movie that inspired Godzilla, and it has special effects by Ray Harryhausen, who loves his monsters. Harryhausen monsters are very detailed and loving, and he makes them characters, and he wants the audience to love them too. And the monster in The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms is always very well lit. He's very lively, the way he's animated. It's because Harryhausen is a total dinosaur freak, and he sort of wants to celebrate how cool dinosaurs are. So he made a movie, so the movie's about this like dinosaur that escapes and starts running around, but you feel for it the way you might feel for King Kong. It's not horror in that way. It's not really scary. It's dazzling and exciting, but it's not really horror, Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. Godzilla is horror. It's a horror movie because the monster in Godzilla from 1954 is terrifying. Godzilla is not well lit. He's very, he's very indistinct. It's this like inky black figure. It moves very sluggishly and very to the point. Like, it has a malevolent intelligence. There's something about the way Godzilla operates here that is kind of cruel. It's shot in this really high contrast black and white. So most of the shots with Godzilla, you only really see him through highlights on his skin, and he's obscured in some way. Either he's in a shadow or there's buildings in the foreground. And he sort of operates as this like elemental darkness. Like he is this sort of force of fate punishing Japan. And that's the way it feels. It feels punishing. It doesn't feel like a monster somewhere it shouldn't be and sort of destroying everything, trying to get out of that situation. It feels like he is inflicting a punishment. And like, obviously Godzilla is about the psychic trauma over World War II. It's about the atomic bomb. You know, it calls to mind Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but like, it is also a movie about like the guilt and shame of Japan following the deeds of imperialist Japan. And it's also about like the question of no one deserves to have the atomic bomb dropped on them, but like, do we deserve, like, what do we deserve? What have we wrought? Is this what mankind has done? And does mankind deserve to go on? Is like, that's the kind of existential question being provoked when Godzilla is stomping through the city of Tokyo, and like the breath he breathes is so unnatural. Again, like, it's not like an animal. The smoke coming out of his mouth doesn't resemble any animal in nature. It is simply a representation of nuclear fallout. And the music is not really exciting for a lot of it. It's a lot more mournful. There's all these funereal horns, and it's just, everything is covered in flames. It's totally hellish. It's not even a war movie, but it's like one of the most hellish depictions of war you've ever seen. And it's just crazy to me that they made this movie 9 years after the atomic bombs were dropped. Like, the wounds of war were so fresh. And like, this must have been such an intense experience to be a Japanese person and to see this in theaters in 1954. And it must have been so overwhelming. And of course, the whole sequence famously ends with this mother cradling her children in her arms and saying that they're going to be with their father soon, which is like just extremely bleak, sort of like a disaster is happening and we will not survive it. But also there's like implications where it's like, did the father, like, how did the father die? Did the father die in World War II? You know, is there like some sort of sense of cause and effect? They're the age where their father was probably, you know, in the military. And I don't know if there's ever really been a national trauma of the scale of the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima that have ever been explored in like such a brutal and intense way so soon after it happened. And I like, every time I watch this movie, I'm just absolutely amazed that the series went on and it became like, Godzilla is this cuddly hero dinosaur who protects the earth. But also it's like, maybe you kind of have to. Maybe it's just so horrifying and bleak that you have to redeem it in some way. You have to find a way to manufacture a happy ending, because the ending of Godzilla is not like, they defeat Godzilla. It's not a happy ending at all. It is in fact the introduction of a new world destroying weapon. Just like really, really bad vibes throughout that original Godzilla movie. Really intense and very scary in a way that most kaiju movies are not. And that's why it is the 51st actual scariest movie moment.
In that vein, the number 50 choice is Shin Godzilla from 2016. And this is directed by Hideki Anno and Shinji Higuchi. So for a long time, Godzilla slowly became a sort of pop culture icon, a good guy. The studio for years struggled with how to make money off that original movie without spending too much money. And they tried all sorts of different things. And so we're left with maybe 4 or 5 Godzilla movies that really feel like horror movies. And then the US reboot happened. I feel like that movie captured some of the horror of it all, while also making Godzilla a good guy instead of a just force of nature. And the Japanese production people sort of went off the popularity of that, and they went to the Hideki Anno, who had just spent a decade plus making and remaking a metatextual apocalyptic giant mech series called Neon Genesis Evangelion, which is, not so secretly, actually a series about his own mental health. He comes off that, and those are popular but controversial. The reboots and stuff are very controversial at the time, and they go to him, and it is ultimately it became a big, huge hit in Japan because it's sort of a life-affirming and a government-affirming picture following the Fukushima nuclear fallout, which was a disaster much smaller scale than nuclear bombs dropping on your country, but was still a really big deal. And it's funny watching it as an American because it does not feel life-affirming. It feels like doom. It feels like what Patrick just said about the other movie where they win at the end, but at what cost kind of situation. And so instead of a character with personality like he had been played for so many years, Godzilla is once again this sort of unknowable cosmic horror that just appears and evolves and becomes a worse and worse monster as it goes. And meanwhile, the authorities stage endless meetings to decide what to do about it. And it's just tied in bureaucracy and red tape. And then in the scene in question, just when things seem their most hopeless and Godzilla has reached like his final form, things get so much worse because he just vomits an ocean of nuclear breath onto the streets and he just shreds everything. And it's just such... I like disaster movies in part because they make me feel all that sick dread at the scale of destruction. I don't think there's a single scene I can think of in any other movie that matches this one as far as the absolute despair that happens when you realize the monster has this much power at its disposal and that all it wants to do is destroy you. There's nothing you can do about it. And so that's why I picked it, because it just genuinely fucking scared me. The first time I saw the movie, it was thrilling, but it was also just like, oh, fuck. It's just an oh, fuck moment. It's kind of similar to the Mononoke moment. It's just a point of no return. How can they possibly deal with this?
The funny thing about that is when you picked this movie, I thought to myself, isn't that the like really uplifting, exciting, optimistic Godzilla movie? Because in my head, I watched it during COVID for the first time. And watching a movie about a government of motivated experts who are all working together to solve a catastrophizing problem that gets worse and worse and like are all making the best possible effort to save all of the people that they ostensibly work for as public servants is like a fucking fantasy if you are in America in 2020 and going through the COVID pandemic.
And that's exactly why it was such a hit in Japan at the time. And it's just something I didn't see the first time I watched it.
Right.
It just was not in my mind back in 2016.
And then when I watched the scene, it's like you're everything you said is absolutely right. It's like it's very bleak and very dark and like even photographically, it's just in a way that other Godzilla movies really had not been for decades and decades at that point. Number 49 is Deep Red from 1975 by Dario Argento. As with The Fifth Court, I refuse to recap the plot. Not important for the scene. This is a movie I almost didn't pick because I assumed it was already chosen by Shudder. I was just like, there's no way they didn't choose Deep Red. And I think what happened is they used a clip from the movie in one of their openings, the way you talked about earlier. And that must be why I thought it was part of the Shudder list. But it is not. It has not been part of the Shudder list or the Bravo list. Nonetheless, it is like one of the most obvious, like, famous giallo films ever, horror movies ever. Like, everyone who watches Suspiria and goes, wow, that was amazing, what do I watch next? Everyone says Deep Red. And so, like, this is almost like it kind of doesn't belong on the list because it's so obvious, but whatever. The scene I'm picking is also very obvious. It's the scene of Professor Giordani's death. You know, he has been helping this investigation of the series of murders. He knows there's murders going on, and as he's in his study, you start hearing that goblin funk music, and you go, oh shit, he's going to get murdered. That's the murder music. And at some point he hears a crunch and of something. I don't even know exactly what that sound is. And then a disembodied voice starts whispering his name, which is one of my favorite giallo tropes, which is just like, where could that voice be coming from? Where in real life it's like, oh, the guy's behind the curtain. but in giallo movies, someone will whisper something and they'll be looking all around them, being like, where could that voice have possibly come from? I guess all murderers are ventriloquists. But you get this like big buildup. The goblin score in Deep Red is a lot less spooky than Suspiria, and it is a lot more like hard rock and funk kind of fun. I think in general, Deep Red is a movie that's kind of like, we're here to have a good time. Let's go hard. And the music kind of reflects that. And so it's a lot of like camera pushing in on his face. He's looking around, doesn't know where the killer is, camera pushing on his face, but this is the killer's music. This is how a Dario Argento murder scene happens. The killer is going to come out when the music comes. And then it stops. And then there's a quiet. And what happened is we're kind of operating on the rule of threes here because we've seen 2 brutal murders so far. So we know the killer is like, oh yeah, they dress in this black coat, hat, black gloves, classic Giallo uniform. So we're like, okay, where is he going to pop out? But the thing we're going to think is going to pop out is this murderer dressed as this classic Giallo killer. What we don't expect is for the door in the back of the shot to fly open and a tiny little prancing laughing man in a tuxedo kind of glides towards the camera. And because it's this long shot, you don't even know what it is when it enters. And like, even when you kind of get the shape of it, the movements are so fucking weird that you still don't know. And then as it gets closer, you're like, okay, it's a doll, but it has like this really creepy face and it's like smiling, but like, is it alive? Is this a killer doll movie? Is that the twist? Is it being like public? What the fuck is going on? And then Giordani swings the knife at its ceramic head and it cleaves it in half. And you see there's a mechanism operating underneath. So it's like, oh, it's a mechanical doll. That's not an explanation. Where'd the doll come from? Who
How
made that
did he
doll?
make it come out of the door at that exact moment?
Because then the killer, like, as you are like, wait a second, that doesn't explain anything. That's when the killer jumps out from behind the curtain. Totally Bugs Bunny powers, just out of nowhere. And then when you're like, wait a second, he was over there. That's when he starts bashing Giordani's teeth in against the mantle. And I am like terrified of tooth stuff. Dental stuff like really freaks me out. I don't even really like seeing people smile sometimes if their smile is toothy. Like, I just fucking hate teeth. So it's like the most inexplicable jump scare followed by the most brutal and intimate violence you can imagine. The killer smashed Giordani's head back onto the desk and then you see his lips are all cut up and chapped in a like just like absolutely fucking grotesque makeup effect. And then he gets a knife in the neck and that's the end of the scene. But it's like, it's one of those things where it's like everyone knows this movie. Everyone remembers this scene from this movie. It's a classic for a reason. But hey, for some reason, Shudder didn't include it, so I get to include it as my number 49 actual scariest movie moment.
The only thing I'll add, other than this is a great movie and I love it, is that there is a fun thing if you rewatch Deep Red, where the murders are all hinted at earlier in the film. So with the tooth thing, the main character is saying, someone asks, "Why do you play piano?" and he says, my psychiatrist would say it's because I'm imagining the keys are his teeth and I'm bashing them in.
Oh, I never picked up on that.
And then later in the movie, he gets scalded by some sort of coffee machine in a sort of funny scene, which then hints at the fact that the killer is going to scald someone to death with hot water.
Right.
Fun movie that keeps giving.
Never picked up on that. Yeah, it's pretty good.
Number 48 is Straw Dogs from 1971, directed by Sam Peckinpah. And this is almost certainly Peckinpah's most notorious and controversial film, but I also think it's his most complex film. I don't like the idea of defending simulated rape on film, nor do I want to defend Peckinpah's reputation as a filmmaker, because all the behind-the-scenes stories point him out to be an alcoholic prick, and he was what he was. But I do think that this particular movie is misunderstood because it's textually not a rape revenge movie, as it is often characterized. The rape scene exists for the sake of one character, not another character. And then I've heard the thing, I don't know if Peckinpah himself said this or if this is just something that came up from critics talking about it, but I agree with the idea that Susan George's character is the protagonist of the story and Dustin Hoffman's character is the antagonist of the story, but that it's purposefully muddled because we're watching the story from Hoffman's point of view, and you have to take yourself out of the situation and think critically about it to realize that he's the problem and he's the antagonist. But the movie doesn't give you a chance to do that. It's a little bit like the Travis Bickle effect. So the scene in question is not the infamous rape sequence, which is really hard to watch. But later, there's a scene that really verifies that Susan George is the protagonist because it's so subjectively shot and edited with her in mind. And in the scene, she is trying to maintain her sense of normalcy. She doesn't want people to know about the rape. She doesn't want to tell Dustin Hoffman about it. She's trying to put it out of her mind. And she's in a very public place. It's like a church social. And there's a lot of hubbub and noise, and she sees the rapist. And she has an anxiety attack, and Peckinpah signifies this in a really simple way with quick edits of the rape. I remember I had major anxiety disorder when I was a teenager the first time I saw this film. And I remember it feeling like this truly authentic representation of what it feels like to have an anxiety attack when you're trapped in this moment where you're having intrusive thoughts, but you're trying to maintain normalcy for all the people around you so that they aren't worried about you or asking you questions and driving you to even worse anxiety attack. And I think other movies since have done more elaborate things like dropping out the soundtrack, messing with the lighting, introducing special effects. But there's something about the simplicity of this particular anxiety attack that has always stuck with me. It's not the most shocking or dreadful thing, but I think it's an insightful example of fear and how it can be represented in a motion picture.
I totally agree. And I'm absolutely not in any position to litigate Straw Dogs and if it is or is not misogynist or anything like that. But I will say that, like, I think the thing that Straw Dogs is, wherever you land, is that way because Sam Peckinpah set out to make it that way and achieved it well. Like, every scene plays, I feel, the way he intended it to. And, like, this is one of those scenes where it's just like he absolutely hits the notes that he needs to hit in that moment. And whether or not everything adds up to being a noble goal or an ignoble one. Not going to get into it, but like extremely frightening moment in this movie. And also, spirit of the list here, it's not the moment people think of. People think of the violence, the shocking violence at the end, and they think of the shocking nature of the rape scene, but they don't think of this, but it's very good. Number 47, unfortunately, we have to dive back into really scuzzy material featuring directors who may be horrible people. 1947 is Frenzy from 1972, directed by Alfred Hitchcock. It's his second to last film, and I think it's easily one of his best. It's a really weird and interesting combination of Psycho and the way that movie has all this psychosexual violence and the way it fucks with audience identification. It merges that with like one of his Wrong Man on the Run thrillers, where someone is accused of a crime that they didn't commit and they have to go on the run. And part of the way it challenges audience identification is in the way we view the protagonist and the antagonist, because the hero of the film is Richard, and he's very angry, and he's violent, and he's desperate, and he's an alcoholic, and he just seems like really unpleasant. And he's just, the whole beginning of this movie, he's just shouting at people. And even towards the end of the movie, he's just being a prick to everyone around him. And the murderer of the villain is actually, because it's a story about a series of sex crimes that are being committed, and they're being committed by his old war buddy, Bob, who is charming, and he's handsome, and he's very successful. He runs a grocery store, and there's even a scene where he's like hanging out with his mom, and so he's like, oh, he's a loving son, too. It just so happens that he likes to sexually assault women and then strangle them with neckties. One of the really provocative things that Hitchcock does in this movie is that he's very liberally indulging in the new freedoms of the 1970s, but still, like, parts of this feel very old-fashioned. So there are certain shots that feel like they're staged the way he would have done it in the 50s, and there are certain shots that it's like, oh my God, this is, even for 1972, this is pretty shocking. And so it's like, there's nudity in this movie. There's a really, really nasty, very long, graphic rape scene where Bob murders Richard's ex-wife. And naturally, he's the ex-husband, so he's the number one suspect, and he has to go on the run. And so Richard is hiding out with his girlfriend Barbara in this hotel where he runs into another old war buddy who offers both of them a job. So there's the scene of the movie I want to talk about that like really creeped me out the first time I saw that, and even subsequent times I saw this, is after the scene in the hotel where they both get their offered jobs. Barbara heads back to her apartment to collect her things. Now, she lives in the pub where she used to work with Richard, and her boss, who just fired Richard at the start of the movie, starts harassing her, and he's telling her that the police know that Richard's the murderer. Everyone knows that she's been with him. They're going to get him. What are you doing here? Everyone knows that you're shacking up with a murderer. And she gets so upset that she leaves without collecting her things. And she steps out into the street, and she's trying to figure out her next move, and the camera pushes in right into her face, and all of the street noise totally fades away. And there's just like a couple seconds of her face as she's searching, like trying to figure out what her next move is going to be. And then you just hear Bob's voice come in going with, "Have you got a place to stay?" And it's like, no, it's like that absolute, like, just brick dropping at the pit of your stomach. That's the last person who you want to show up right now. Because we saw Bob already commit like just horrible acts, and we know that he's a predator, and we know that he knows that everyone wants to blame Richard for his crimes, which is very good for him. And we know that he knows that she's trying to help Richard get away, which is very bad for him. So he has all the motivation in the world to murder her. And he comes up to her, and he's very charming, and he's asking if she's okay. He's asking how he can help. And eventually he even goes, "You know what? If you need to lay low for a while, you can stay at my place. You know, I'm going to be out of town, so go ahead, stay at my place." And he even offers to go back to the pub to pick up her things. And eventually they get to his building as they're talking, and we get this absolutely incredibly long, beautiful tracking shot where the camera follows them up the stairs to his apartment, and you see him walking behind her, and his face sort of changes from this charming man facade that he puts on for everyone into the psychopathic killer that he actually is. And he lets her into his apartment, and he says, "I don't know if you know, Babs, but you're my type of woman." And then he closes the door, and that's what he said to Richard's ex-wife before he killed her. So then, all still in the same shot, we're now very silent. The camera backs away very slowly down the stairs and out the door, and it's just total silence. And then eventually the street noise comes back. And it's like you already saw just like one of the most horrible sex murders on film ever, like in the previous scene. So you know what's happening behind that door, but Hitchcock forces us to imagine it. We don't get a scream. We don't get any kind of abstraction. It's just purely in our imagination. And then the street noise returns, and everyone's just walking around as if nothing's happening up there. And there's this like really chilling implication that this could be happening behind any door. You live in a city, look up at the window, you're going to, the worst things you could possibly imagine might be happening behind there. There's all this potential violence anywhere. And that's kind of like the movie itself is making that a larger point, where it's this really misanthropic movie that implies that like, it's kind of a natural state that men want to kill women. They're all predators. And it's like Richard, who's the hero of the movie, is innocent technically, but he's also very much the kind of person you would believe would get drunk and mad and kill his ex-wife. It's just he didn't happen to do it this time. You get all these scenes of the lead homicide detective, and he's just sort of like simmering with resentment because his wife has gotten into French cooking and she's making him these horrible meals. It's like it's very funny, sort of weird comic relief. Stuff that you keep returning to. Earlier in the movie, there's a scene where in a bar where two men are very cavalier in discussing the murders, and one of them makes a really gross rape joke to a woman who's working at the bar. And it's this like very bleak worldview where all men are guilty, even the innocent ones, because deep down, all men want to kill women. And it's like it's such a dark movie, but it's also extremely funny. And it's also like as a thriller about a man on the run who's going to get caught, like it's very taut. And it is Hitchcock at the height of his powers in terms of how he uses the camera and everything. And all of that sort of gets tied back into that one sequence where Barbara, just the wrong twist of fate, runs into the wrong person at the wrong time, and she gets sort of led into the spider's web. Frenzy, fucking great movie. Probably a gross movie expressing gross things. It's a gross man expressing gross things, but like just as an achievement, it's incredible movie.
I don't know if you did this on purpose, but it kind of ties back into Deep Red, because the inciting event in Deep Red is that the protagonist happens to look up at a window as a murder is happening.
Oh, I did not do that on purpose. No,
in
that's
a high-rise apartment.
Yeah, that's funny.
I don't know if you know it, Babs, but you're my type of woman.
All right, so we're going to end things here, not forever, but just for now, with my number 46, which is a pretty obvious choice for me, is Drag Me to Hell, directed by Sam Raimi from 2009. I'll be 100% honest and say that Drag Me to Hell never really scared me, if you know what I mean. It's more that it's such a perfectly honed spookablast, which is his term, machine, that I just feel exhilarated when I watch it. And the climax is my favorite bit of payoff in maybe any horror movie. at least modern, and of this type. So Raimi does this wonderful job of setting up events and he puts us and Alison Lohman's character through the ringer emotionally and physically all throughout the film. And even though the literal title of the film tells us what is going to happen, we firmly believe that she has found an effective loophole to avoid being dragged to hell by regifting a button that holds the curse that she's been cursed with, I guess. She regifts it to the body of the woman who cursed her in the first place. And it's this big, exciting scene, and it feels really triumphant. But then in what we think is just the end of the movie, her fiance casually reveals that he has the button, which when I first saw this movie, thought it meant, oh my God, he's going to die. But that she accidentally shoved a collectible coin of his into the corpse's mouth. And in her shock, she tumbles onto the tracks, and they're at Union Station. And this sort of implies, oh, she's going to be killed by an oncoming train. But once again, Sam Raimi has tricked us into looking the wrong way and checking out his left hand. Well, with his right hand, he literally drags the protagonist to hell, just as the title promised. And it's genuinely one of the greatest horror movies ever made. And there's a lot to read into its subtext. And for instance, she is initially cursed because she opts to foreclose on this elderly Romani woman's house. And it's purely to further her own career. So she ruins someone's life because it's going to make her a better capitalist, basically. And it's important to realize this was released the year after the 2008 real estate crash.
Yep.
But on a purely technical level, Raimi is playing with us so well that he can name the movie what's going to happen at the end. And we continuously think that the protagonist has gotten out of her responsibility and the promise of the title.
I think one of the defining factors for Drag Me to Hell to me is that so many horror filmmakers really fail in their attempts to integrate CGI into horror. It often is just like, oh, well, no, now I'm out of the movie. That's not really happening. That's not scary because that's just a bunch of pixels. And like Sam Raimi had a 3-movie training course across the Spider-Man movies and how to utilize CGI. And Drag Me to Hell is like, all right, I really had to flex my imagination to achieve some of the special effects in the Evil Dead movies, and now the training weights are off because not only do I have advanced technology that I didn't have back in the 80s, I also have, I've been very well trained on how to integrate CGI and live action, and so much of Drag Me to Hell is like his imagination finally being able to do all of these things that you could never do elsewhere. And it's like one of the few triumphs of CGI in the horror genre.
So that brings us to the end of part 2. Patrick, remind people where they can find you if you want to be found.
They can find me at Uptown Song Club on Instagram and Uptown Song Club on Blue Sky.
And you can reach me at the Genre Grinder website, at the Genre Grinder Facebook page, at Genre Grinder on Twitter, Gabe M as in Matthew Powers on Twitter. I can be reached as Gabe Powers on Blue Sky, and I have Genre Grinder Gabe on Instagram. And I also forgot in the last episode to say that we have a Genre Grinder Patreon if you have a couple of bucks and want to help out with my hosting fees for the website. Thank you to everyone who has joined that, except for Patrick, who, he just owes me.
That's right. It's penance, and
no thanks needed.
That's correct.
He's an employee basically who pays me.
Wait a second. I need a new accountant. I got this all backwards.
So until next time, have a great spooky season and goodbye.
Bye.
Every time you kiss me, Lord, makes me feel so good. Dig the way you hold me tight. You love me like a woman, sure, and that's why